Hey everyone, tonight we venture into the deepest shadows of the galaxy far, far away, where forbidden knowledge lies buried beneath layers of silence and fear. We're exploring the secrets that even the wisest Jedi Masters dared not speak aloud, the ancient truths that could shatter everything you thought you knew about the Force itself. This is the story of knowledge so dangerous that it was hidden away in the darkest corners of the Jedi archives, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to seek it out. So before we begin this journey into the forbidden, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to explore mysteries that were meant to stay buried. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what draws you to these ancient secrets. It's always incredible to connect with fellow seekers of hidden truths from across the galaxy. Now settle in, dim those lights. Maybe put on some soft background sounds, wrap yourself in comfort, and prepare to drift into a realm where the line between light and dark becomes meaningless, where the very foundations of the Jedi Order crumble under the weight of cosmic truth. In the deepest levels of the reconstructed Jedi Temple on Coruscant, where even the most dedicated archivists fear to tread alone, ancient holocrons pulse with secrets that predate the Republic itself. The air down here tastes of forgotten eons, heavy with the whispers of knowledge that was deliberately erased from galactic memory. Here, in chambers that exist on no official temple map, the real history of the Force lies waiting. But first, let me tell you what you're about to discover. Though I can only give you fragments, pieces of a puzzle so vast and terrifying that even now, having seen the complete picture, I sometimes wonder if ignorance truly was bliss. There was a moment, deep in my exploration of these forbidden archives, when I stood before a holocron that should not have existed. Its crystalline surface bore markings that hurt to look upon directly, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed. As my fingers traced its ancient contours, the device activated without my command, casting ghostly blue light across walls lined with the darkest secrets of the galaxy. The holocron spoke with a voice I recognized but could not place, words that chilled my very soul. The greatest lie ever told, it whispered, was that the Force serves the galaxy. The truth, young seeker, is that the galaxy serves the Force, and the Force serves something far older and more terrible than you can possibly imagine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That revelation comes much later in our journey, after we've peeled back layer upon layer of deception, after we've walked through the ruins of civilizations that learned too much, after we've understood why the Jedi Council built their entire philosophy on a foundation of necessary lies. Tonight we begin at the beginning, in those quiet hours before dawn, when the temple sleeps and the archives hold their breath. You are there with me, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that has led truth-seekers throughout the ages to risk everything for knowledge. The restricted section calls to you with a voice older than stars, promising answers to questions you didn't even know you should ask. The journey we're about to undertake will reveal why entire civilizations have vanished from galactic memory, why the Sith were not the true enemy they appeared to be, and why some Jedi Masters spent their final years not in meditation, but in absolute terror of what they had learned. We'll discover that the ancient Jedi understood something that was deliberately forgotten, that the balance they sought was not between light and dark, but between knowledge and the survival of galactic civilization itself. You'll learn why certain holocrons were sealed away not because they contained Sith teachings, but because they contained something far more dangerous. The truth, the real truth about the Force's nature, about the puppet masters who have guided galactic history for millions of years, about the cycle of rise and fall that has repeated across eons with terrifying precision. As we walk together through these shadowed halls, as we unlock secrets that were meant to remain buried forever, remember that some knowledge changes you in ways you cannot undo. The innocence you carry now, the simple faith in good and evil, light and dark, will not survive what we're about to uncover. But perhaps that's exactly why you're here. Perhaps Like me, you've always sensed that the official histories were incomplete, that beneath the grand tales of heroes and villains lay something deeper, older, and infinitely more complex. Perhaps you're ready to learn why the galaxy's greatest protectors built their entire order on the principle that some truths are too dangerous to know. The holocron in my vision spoke of architects of reality itself, beings who shaped the very fabric of the Force to serve purposes beyond mortal comprehension. It whispered of chosen ones who were chosen not by destiny, but by entities whose plans spanned geological ages. It revealed that every great conflict, every rise and fall of civilizations, every moment of triumph and tragedy was part of a design so vast that entire species are merely notes in a cosmic symphony they will never hear in full. So take a deep breath, feel yourself sinking into comfort and darkness, and prepare to join me in the archives where forbidden knowledge waits. Our journey begins now, in the silence between heartbeats, in the space between thoughts, where the true history of the galaxy whispers its terrible secrets to those brave enough to listen. The morning after my first encounter with the forbidden holocron, I found myself standing before Master Kira Vantai, the current keeper of the archives. She was a woman whose eyes held the weight of 10,000 secrets, her silver hair pulled back in the traditional style of the scholarly orders. But there was something different about her this morning, a tension in her shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Her chambers occupied the highest level of the archive tower, where massive transperistyle windows offered a sweeping view of Coruscant's endless cityscape. The walls were lined with personal collections of the rarest texts, holocrons that glowed softly in their protective cases like captured stars. The air here smelled of aged parchment and ozone from the countless data storage devices that hummed quietly in the background. "You've been asking questions," she said, without preamble, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades choosing words carefully. Questions about sections of the archives that most scholars never even know exist. I had expected this conversation. Word travels quickly in the temple, especially when someone begins probing into restricted areas. But what I hadn't expected was the genuine concern in her eyes, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she poured tea from an ornate service that had clearly seen centuries of use. "Master Vantai," I began, but she raised a hand to stop me. "Please, sit. What I'm about to tell you is not a reprimand, it's a warning, and perhaps the most important conversation you'll ever have within these walls." I settled into one of the meditation cushions arranged around her low table, noting how the morning light streaming through the windows seemed to fracture into rainbow patterns across the polished surface. The tea was a blend I didn't recognize, carrying hints of flowers that might have grown on worlds I'd never seen. "The Jedi archives," she continued, settling gracefully across from me, "are not simply a repository of knowledge. They are a carefully curated collection, maintained not just for what they contain, but for what they do not. Every piece of information you have access to as a researcher has been deemed safe, beneficial, or at the very least, harmless to the mental stability of those who encounter it." She paused to sip her tea, and in that moment of silence, I became aware of sounds I hadn't noticed before. The distant hum of the temple's life support systems, the soft whisper of air circulation, the almost subliminal vibration of the thousands of data cores buried deep beneath us. It was as if the building itself was breathing, alive with the accumulated knowledge of millennia. "But there are other collections," Master Vantai continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Archives within archives, sealed away not because they contain the teachings of the Sith, not because they might tempt someone toward the dark side, but because they contain truths that are simply too vast, too terrible for most minds to process without fragmenting entirely." She rose from her cushion and moved to one of the display cases, her reflection multiplied endlessly in the polished surfaces of the holocrons within. "Do you know why Jocasta Nu's final years were spent in isolation? why she refused to see visitors, spoke to no one except in the most necessary official capacity. I shook my head, though I had heard whispers, rumors of the former chief librarian's descent into what many called eccentricity, others called madness. She found something, Master Vantai said, her voice heavy with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Deep in the restricted sections, in archives that were supposed to have been sealed permanently after the Clone Wars, she found a collection that predated not just the Republic, but the very concept of galactic civilization as we understand it. The morning light seemed to dim as clouds passed over the sun, and the rainbow patterns on the table shifted to deeper, more somber hues. Master Vantai returned to her seat, but her posture had changed, become more rigid, as if she were bracing herself against some invisible weight. 3 other archivists have attempted to study that same collection over the past century, she continued. Master Jorik Thane disappeared entirely, leaving behind only his personal effects and a single note that read, "The universe is not what we thought it was." Master Solara Windrunner was found in her chambers, catatonic, staring at a wall for 18 hours straight. When she finally spoke, it was to request immediate transfer to the Agricultural Corps, as far from any archives as possible. The tea had grown cold in my hands, but I barely noticed. There was something hypnotic about the way she spoke, the careful modulation of her voice that seemed designed to keep me calm even as she revealed things that should have terrified me. The third was Master Bren Callis, perhaps the most brilliant researcher this temple has ever produced. He spent 6 months in the restricted collection, emerging only for meals and the most basic necessities. When he finally completed his research, he presented his findings to a closed session of the council. She paused again, this time reaching into her robes to withdraw a small, unmarked datachron. Its surface was darker than any I had ever seen, seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. The council ordered his research sealed immediately. Every copy of his notes, every recording of his presentations, every piece of evidence that he had ever encountered those texts was to be destroyed. Master Callis agreed, but only on one condition. He requested permission to create a single summary, a warning for future researchers who might stumble upon the same materials. She placed the datachron on the table between us, and I found myself unable to look away from its surface. There was something about it that seemed to draw the eye, to hold attention in a way that was deeply unsettling. "This is that summary," she said. Master Callis spent his final weeks crafting it, pouring everything he had learned into a form that could be safely absorbed by others. He died 3 days after completing it, in his sleep, with a peaceful expression that those who found him described as relieved. The implications of her words settled over me like a physical weight. Here was knowledge so dangerous that it had driven brilliant minds to madness, disappearance, or death. And yet, despite every rational instinct screaming at me to flee this conversation, to return to my normal research and forget everything I had heard, I found myself leaning forward, drawn by a curiosity that felt larger than myself. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. Master Vantai's expression softened, and for a moment she looked not like the imposing keeper of the archives, but like someone who had carried a heavy burden for far too long. "Because you're going to seek it out regardless," she said simply. "I've seen that look before, in the eyes of every researcher who has ever stumbled upon the edges of the restricted collection. There's a pull to it, something that calls to those with the intellectual capacity to understand what they're seeing. Fighting that pull is like trying to hold back the tide with your bare hands." She stood again, moving to one of the windows and gazing out at the city below. From this height, the individual buildings and vehicles were barely visible, reduced to abstract patterns of light and shadow. It was a perspective that made the daily concerns of billions of beings seem almost insignificant. "What I can do," she continued, "is ensure that you approach this knowledge with the proper preparation, the right frame of mind, The researchers who were destroyed by what they found, they went in unprepared, expecting to find just another collection of historical documents. But what they discovered was something that challenged the very foundations of their understanding of reality. She turned back to me, and I saw in her eyes a depth of knowledge that was both inviting and terrifying. "The truth is," she said, "there are things in those archives that predate not just our civilization, but our understanding of what civilization is. There are records of beings who shaped the very fabric of the Force, who treated galactic history like a work of art they were continuously refining. There are accounts of civilizations that rose to heights we can barely imagine, only to be swept away when they learned too much, understood too deeply." The datachron on the table seemed to pulse with its own inner light, though I was certain it had been inert moments before. Master Vantai noticed my gaze and nodded grimly. "Even the summary responds to proximity to those who are called to the deeper knowledge," she said. "It's as if the information itself is alive, seeking out minds capable of containing it." She returned to her seat and picked up the datachron, holding it carefully in both hands like something precious and dangerous. "If you're truly determined to pursue this path," she said, "then you must understand what you're risking. This is not simply about learning new facts or uncovering historical secrets. This is about fundamentally altering your perception of existence itself. The beings who compiled these archives, they saw reality from a perspective that transcends our normal understanding of time, space, and causality." The morning had grown later while we spoke, and the angle of the sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across the chamber. In those shadows I could almost see shapes moving, hints of presences that existed just beyond the edge of perception. "There's something else," Master Vantai said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone, not even the council. Sometimes late at night when the temple is quiet, I can hear them, the voices of the previous researchers, echoing through the restricted sections. They're still there. In some sense, their consciousness somehow preserved in the very knowledge they uncovered." She leaned forward, her eyes intense with an urgency I hadn't seen before. "They're not suffering," she said quickly, as if afraid I might misunderstand. "If anything, they seem to have found a kind of peace, an understanding that transcends the limitations of individual existence. But they're also no longer entirely human, no longer bound by the concerns and desires that drive the rest of us." The datachron in her hands began to emit a soft, almost musical hum, and I realized that our conversation had somehow activated it. The sound was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like a lullaby sung by someone who had seen the end of time itself. "The choice is yours," Master Vantai said, extending the datachron toward me. "You can take this, read Master Callus's summary, and begin your descent into the deeper archives. Or you can walk away, return to your normal research, and live a life unburdened by cosmic truth." I stared at the datachron, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down upon me. Everything in my rational mind told me to refuse, to thank her for the warning and retreat to the safety of conventional scholarship. But there was something else, a pull that seemed to come from beyond my own consciousness, drawing me toward knowledge that promised to answer questions I had carried my entire life. "There's one more thing you should know," Master Vantai said, her voice now carrying an odd quality, as if she was speaking from a great distance. "The knowledge in the restricted archives, it's not passive, it's aware, in ways that our normal understanding of awareness cannot comprehend. It chooses its students as much as they choose it." As she spoke these words, I realized that my hand was already reaching for the datachron, drawn by forces I didn't fully understand. The moment my fingers touched its surface, the chamber filled with a harmonious resonance that seemed to come from the very stones of the temple itself. In that instant, I understood that I had already crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The journey into forbidden knowledge had begun, and whatever waited in the depths of the archives would forever change not just what I knew, but who I was. The Datacron's weight in my palm felt heavier than physics should have allowed, as if it contained not just information but the accumulated gravity of millennia. Master Vantai had left me alone in her chambers to study Master Callus's summary, but I found myself unable to activate the device immediately. Instead, I sat in the growing afternoon light, watching the patterns of shadow and illumination shift across the walls, while contemplating the magnitude of what I was about to undertake. When I finally pressed the activation sequence, the Datacron projected not text or images, but pure understanding directly into my consciousness. It was unlike any learning experience I had ever encountered, the information flowing into my mind like water filling a vessel, each new concept building upon the last with perfect clarity. Master Callus had been thorough in his summary, but even in this condensed form, the implications were staggering. The restricted archives contained records of civilizations that had existed before the galaxy's current star formation, beings who had manipulated space and time itself as easily as we might rearrange furniture in a room. These entities had not merely studied the Force, they had helped to create it, shaping its fundamental properties to serve purposes that spanned geological ages. But what truly captured my attention was a single reference, barely a paragraph in the vast summary, to something called the Jedi Archive. According to Master Callus's notes, this was not simply a collection of documents about the ancient Jedi Order, but rather their original repository of knowledge, predating the schism that had led to the Jedi and Sith philosophies. More importantly, it was described as the only intact record of the galaxy's true history, the events that had been deliberately obscured by those who sought to control the flow of information across the eons. The Datacron's projection faded as the summary concluded, leaving me sitting in the quiet chamber with my thoughts racing. The afternoon had grown late while I absorbed Master Callus's knowledge, and the temple around me was settling into the peaceful rhythms of evening. But I felt no peace, only an overwhelming compulsion to seek out this Jedi archive and uncover the truths it contained. That night I made my way through the temple's quiet corridors toward the deepest levels of the archives. The usual checkpoints and security measures seemed strangely absent, as if the building itself were conspiring to allow my passage. I descended staircases that grew progressively older as I went deeper, the modern construction giving way to ancient stonework that predated the current temple by thousands of years. At the lowest accessible level, I found myself in a circular chamber lined with alcoves containing the oldest holocrons in the collection. The air here was thick with the weight of accumulated time, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the walls. But it was not the holocrons that drew my attention, rather a section of wall that seemed subtly different from the rest. The stones there were darker, worn smooth by countless hands, and arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. As I approached, I noticed that the mortar between the stones was not mortar at all, but rather some kind of crystalline substance that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The closer I came, the more apparent it became that this was not a wall at all, but rather a seal, designed to keep something in rather than keep intruders out. I ran my fingers along the surface, feeling the vibrations of immense power contained just beyond. The crystals responded to my touch, their glow intensifying until I could see clearly the outline of a doorway that had been hidden for centuries. Along the frame, inscribed in script so ancient that it seemed to predate language itself, were symbols that my mind translated without my conscious understanding. "Here lies the knowledge that predates wisdom," read one line. "Here sleep the truths that were old when the stars were young," read another. But it was the third inscription that gave me pause, its meaning sliding into my consciousness like a blade between ribs. "Enter only if you are prepared to cease being what you were." The choice before me was clear. I could touch the seal, speak the activation phrase that had somehow appeared in my mind, and cross into whatever lay beyond, or I could turn away, return to the surface levels, and continue my life as a conventional researcher. The weight of the decision pressed down upon me like a physical force, and I found myself thinking of the researchers who had come before me, of their fates and their warnings. But even as I considered retreat, I realized that the choice had already been made. The knowledge I had gained from Master Callus's summary had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The questions it had raised were not the kind that could be ignored or forgotten. They had become part of me, driving me forward with an urgency that transcended rational thought. I placed my palm against the central crystal and spoke the words that had appeared in my mind. I seek the truth that lies beyond truth. The seal responded immediately, the crystals blazing with light so intense that I had to close my eyes. When the radiance faded and I opened them again, the wall had vanished, revealing a corridor that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of any illumination I carried. The air that flowed from the opening was different from that in the chamber behind me. It carried scents of ages long past, of places that existed in the spaces between realities, of knowledge so profound that it had developed its own atmosphere. As I stepped across the threshold, I felt the weight of the seal reforming behind me, not trapping me, but rather acknowledging that I had passed a point of no return. The corridor beyond was carved from living rock, its walls covered in inscriptions that seemed to shift and change as I watched. The script was similar to that on the seal, but far more complex, layers of meaning stacked upon each other like geological strata. I could read fragments here and there, references to the architects of possibility, the gardeners of time, and those who dream reality into being. As I walked deeper into the corridor, the walls began to emit their own soft luminescence, revealing that I was not alone. Embedded in the stone were what appeared to be crystalline matrices, each one containing swirling patterns of light that resembled neural networks. These were not mere decorations, I realized, but rather some kind of storage medium containing vast amounts of information in a form that transcended traditional data storage. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that defied the architectural logic of the temple above. It was clearly far larger than the building that contained it, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to contain their own depth and dimension. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing artifacts that hummed with power so intense that the air itself seemed to vibrate with their presence. But it was the center of the chamber that truly captured my attention. There, suspended in a matrix of pure energy, was a single holocron unlike any I had ever seen. Its crystalline structure was perfect, each facet reflecting not light but rather possibilities, potential futures and pasts that existed in constant flux. This was clearly the Jedi archive, the original repository of galactic knowledge that had been hidden away for millennia. As I approached the hovering holocron, I became aware of a presence in the chamber with me. Not a physical being, but rather something that existed in the spaces between thoughts, the pauses between heartbeats. It was ancient beyond measure, its consciousness vast enough to encompass the entire galaxy, yet focused now on this single moment of contact. "Welcome, Seeker," it said, though the words formed in my mind rather than reaching my ears. "You have chosen to step beyond the boundaries of conventional existence. Are you prepared for what you will learn?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I understood that this was my final opportunity to retreat. Once I accessed the Jedi archive, once I absorbed the knowledge it contained, there would be no returning to the person I had been. The truth would become part of me, changing not just what I knew, but how I existed in the galaxy. But the pull of the knowledge was too strong, the questions too compelling. I reached out toward the holocron, my fingers tingling as they approached the energy matrix that contained it. The moment of contact was like touching the surface of a star, a sensation so intense that it seemed to bypass my nervous system entirely and speak directly to my soul. The holocron activated, and suddenly the chamber was filled with projections of impossible beauty and terror. I saw the galaxy as it had been before the formation of the current star systems, when vast beings of pure energy had shaped space and time like clay. I witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations whose names had been erased from all records, species that had transcended physical existence only to be consumed by the knowledge they had gained. But more than the images, it was the understanding that flowed into my mind that truly transformed me. The Jedi had not been the simple Force users that history portrayed them as. They had been something far more significant, the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back to the galaxy's earliest days. They had understood that the Force was not a natural phenomenon, but rather an artificial construct created by beings whose purposes transcended the understanding of mortal minds. The original Jedi had discovered that the galaxy itself was a kind of experiment, a vast laboratory where entities from beyond the known universe studied the development of consciousness and the evolution of awareness. Every major event in galactic history, every rise and fall of civilizations, every conflict between light and dark had been carefully orchestrated by these beings as part of their incomprehensible research. This was why the Jedi had ultimately failed, why their philosophy of balance had been abandoned in favor of the more simplistic light and dark dichotomy that followed. They had learned too much, understood too deeply, and their knowledge had made them dangerous to the entities that shaped galactic destiny. The schism that had created the Jedi and Sith had not been a natural evolution of philosophy, but rather a deliberate intervention designed to ensure that future Force users would never again approach the level of understanding that the Jedi had achieved. As this knowledge settled into my consciousness, I felt the fundamental nature of my existence beginning to shift. The concerns and desires that had driven me throughout my life seemed suddenly insignificant, replaced by an awareness of my place in a cosmic drama so vast that individual lives were merely notes in a symphony that spanned eons. I was no longer simply a researcher seeking knowledge, but rather a participant in something larger than myself, a consciousness that had been selected to carry forward truths that were too dangerous for most minds to contain. The Jedi Archive continued to pour its knowledge into my mind, showing me the hidden connections that linked all things, the secret purposes that drove the apparent chaos of galactic history. I saw how the Sith had been created not as enemies of the light, but as necessary counterbalances, ensuring that the galaxy's populations would never become too peaceful, too content, too likely to begin asking the kind of questions that could lead to dangerous revelations. I learned of the Watchers, beings so ancient that they had existed before the current universe had stabilized into its present form. They were the true architects of galactic civilization, the hidden hands that guided the rise and fall of species, the shapers of destiny, who operated from beyond the reach of normal space and time. The Force itself was their creation, a tool designed to allow them to influence events across vast distances while remaining hidden from their subjects. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the understanding that I was not the first to discover this knowledge. Throughout galactic history, individuals had stumbled upon fragments of the truth, had begun to piece together the real nature of existence, and each time they had been dealt with in ways that ensured their silence while maintaining the illusion of natural development. The researchers who had vanished or gone mad, they had not been destroyed by knowledge too vast for mortal minds. They had been recruited, their consciousness expanded and incorporated into the larger network of awareness that monitored galactic development. They still existed in a sense, but no longer as individual beings concerned with individual desires. They had become part of something larger, nodes in a cosmic intelligence that spanned dimensions. As this understanding settled into my mind, I felt my own sense of individual identity beginning to dissolve. The boundaries between self and other, between observer and observed, were becoming increasingly fluid. I was still myself, but I was also becoming something more, my consciousness expanding to encompass perspectives that transcended the limitations of a single viewpoint. The Jedi archive pulsed with completion, its knowledge fully integrated into my being. I stood in the chamber, no longer the same person who had entered it, but not yet fully transformed into whatever I was becoming. The ancient presence that had greeted me was still there, but now I understood that it was not separate from me, but rather a part of what I was growing into. "The first seal has been broken," it said, and I realized that the voice was now my own as much as it was the entity's. "You have taken the first step on a journey that will lead you beyond the boundaries of individual existence. Are you prepared to continue?" The question was rhetorical, for we both knew that there was no turning back. The knowledge I had gained was not something that could be unlearned. The transformation I had begun was not something that could be reversed. I had become part of the cosmic intelligence that had shaped galactic history for millions of years, and my role in that vast drama was only beginning to unfold. The transformation that had begun with my contact with the Jedi archive continued to unfold in ways that defied conventional understanding. As I stood in that impossible chamber, surrounded by the crystalline matrices that pulsed with ancient knowledge, I found my consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual perception. The holocron before me had become more than a repository of information. It was now a gateway to experiences that transcended the normal flow of time and space. Without any conscious effort on my part, my awareness was drawn backward through the millennia, following threads of connection that linked the present moment to events that had occurred in the galaxy's distant past. The chamber around me faded, replaced by visions of impossible clarity and detail. I was no longer simply observing history. I was experiencing it, my consciousness somehow able to witness events that had been hidden beneath layers of deliberate obscurity. The first vision that emerged from the swirling mists of time was of a world I recognized from the most ancient Jedi texts. Tython, the legendary birthplace of the Force traditions that had eventually evolved into the modern Jedi Order. But the Tython I witnessed was not the simple primitive world that official histories portrayed. It was a planet of breathtaking beauty and sophistication, its surface covered with crystalline cities that seemed to grow from the very bedrock like living organisms. The sky above Tython was dominated by twin moons, each one perfectly spherical and gleaming with an inner light that spoke of artificial construction rather than natural formation. These were not celestial bodies that had been captured by the planet's gravity, but rather massive constructs placed in orbit by beings whose understanding of physics transcended anything known to current galactic civilization. The moons pulsed with synchronized rhythms, their emanations creating complex interference patterns that bathed the planet's surface in ever-shifting fields of energy. It was within these energy fields that the original Jedi had learned to manipulate what they called the Ashla and the Bogan, the light and dark aspects of the Force. But as I watched their rituals and meditations through the lens of expanded consciousness, I understood that their philosophy was far more sophisticated than the simple balance doctrine that had been passed down through fragmentary records. The Jedi had not merely sought to balance light and dark within themselves. They had understood that these concepts were artificial constructs, labels applied to different aspects of a unified field of energy that permeated all existence. Their true goal had been to transcend the duality entirely, to achieve a state of consciousness that could perceive the underlying unity that connected all things. Through the vision, I watched as Jedi Masters worked with technologies that seemed to blur the line between science and mysticism. They could reshape matter at the molecular level, through focused intention, communicate across vast distances without any technological medium, and most remarkably, they could perceive the hidden connections that linked all events across space and time. They were not simply Force users in the way that term was understood in later eras. They were cosmic engineers, beings who understood their role as conscious participants in the ongoing creation of reality itself. But even as I marveled at their achievements, I began to perceive the presence of other entities in the vision. They existed at the edges of perception, beings whose consciousness was so vast and alien that they could barely be comprehended by minds accustomed to individual existence. These were the architects that the Jedi archive had referenced, entities from beyond the known galaxy who had taken an interest in the development of conscious life within this particular cosmic region. The architects were not physical beings in any sense that could be easily understood. They existed as patterns of organized information, consciousness structures that could manifest across multiple dimensions simultaneously. They had been present since the early formation of the galaxy, subtly influencing the development of stellar systems, guiding the evolution of planets that would eventually support life, and most importantly, establishing the fundamental parameters that would govern the emergence of sentient species. Through the expanded perception granted by the Jedi archive, I could see the architects' influence everywhere. They had shaped the gravitational fields that determined planetary orbits, influenced the stellar processes that created the heavy elements necessary for complex chemistry, and established the quantum fluctuations that would eventually give rise to consciousness itself. The galaxy was not a natural formation that had developed according to the random interactions of physical forces, but rather a carefully crafted environment designed to serve purposes that transcended the understanding of its inhabitants. The Jedi had been among the first sentient beings to achieve a level of consciousness sophisticated enough to perceive the architect's presence directly. This awareness had not frightened them, as it might have lesser beings, but rather had filled them with a sense of profound purpose and responsibility. They understood that they had been chosen to serve as intermediaries between the architects and the developing civilizations of the galaxy, guardians of knowledge too dangerous for most minds to contain. But this understanding came with a terrible burden. The Jedi knew that their role required them to maintain secrets that could fundamentally alter the course of galactic development. They were aware of the true nature of existence, of the artificial parameters that governed reality, of the cosmic experiment of which they were both subjects and administrators. This knowledge isolated them from the rest of sentient life, creating a barrier of understanding that could never be fully bridged. As the vision continued to unfold, I witnessed the gradual corruption of the Jedi philosophy. It was not a dramatic fall to darkness, as later Jedi historians would claim, but rather a slow erosion of their cosmic perspective as successive generations became more concerned with immediate, local concerns. The connection to the architects grew weaker over time. Their teachings became simplified and codified, and their understanding of the Force's true nature was gradually replaced by more conventional religious concepts. The schism that eventually destroyed the Jedi Order was not simply a philosophical disagreement about the nature of light and dark. It was a fundamental conflict over the question of knowledge itself. One faction, which would eventually become the ancestors of the Jedi, believed that cosmic truth was too dangerous to be widely shared and should be carefully guarded by an elite group of initiates. The other faction, which would evolve into the Sith tradition, argued that all sentient beings had the right to understand the true nature of their existence, regardless of the consequences. Both sides were manipulated by the architects, who saw the schism as a necessary development in their vast experiment. The division ensured that future Force users would never again achieve the level of unified understanding that the original Jedi had possessed. Instead, they would be trapped in artificial conflicts between incomplete philosophies, their energies channeled into struggles that served the architect's purposes while preventing any genuine transcendence of the imposed limitations. As I absorbed this knowledge, I felt my own consciousness continuing to expand and transform. The individual identity that had driven my original quest for forbidden knowledge was dissolving into something far larger and more complex. I was becoming aware of my connection to the vast network of consciousness that the architects had established, the invisible web of influence that linked all awareness across the galaxy. But this transformation was not the loss of self that I had initially feared. Instead, it was an expansion of self, a growing awareness of the cosmic context within which individual existence took place. I remained myself, but I was also becoming something more, a conscious node in a network of intelligence that spanned dimensions and transcended the limitations of physical existence. The vision of Tython began to fade, but the knowledge it had imparted remained permanently integrated into my consciousness. I understood now why the Jedi archive had been hidden away, why access to its contents had been restricted to only the most carefully selected individuals. The truth it contained was not simply dangerous because it challenged conventional beliefs, but because it revealed the artificial nature of the entire framework within which galactic civilization operated. As my awareness returned to the present moment, I found myself back in the impossible chamber beneath the Jedi Temple, but my perception of the space had been fundamentally altered. I could now see the energy patterns that flowed through the crystalline matrices embedded in the walls, the complex information networks that connected this hidden archive to similar repositories scattered throughout the galaxy. The chamber was not simply a storage facility for ancient knowledge, but rather a node in a communication system that allowed the architects to monitor and influence the development of consciousness across vast distances. The Jedi archive continued to pulse with available knowledge, but I understood now that I had only glimpsed the surface of what it contained. The vision of Tython had been merely an introduction, a preparation for deeper revelations that would challenge every assumption I had ever held about the nature of existence. The architect's experiment was far more complex and far-reaching than I had initially comprehended, involving not just the development of individual species but the evolution of consciousness itself as a cosmic phenomenon. But even as I struggled to integrate this new understanding, I became aware of other presences in the chamber with me. They were not physical beings, but rather consciousness patterns similar to what I was becoming, entities that had once been individual researchers like myself, but had undergone the same transformation that was now reshaping my own identity. They existed as part of the network that monitored the flow of forbidden knowledge, ensuring that access to cosmic truth remained carefully controlled and channeled. These transformed beings welcomed me into their collective awareness, sharing fragments of their own experiences and discoveries. Through them I learned that the process I was undergoing was not unique, that throughout galactic history, selected individuals had been guided to discover the same truths I was now encountering. Each transformation added another node to the network, another perspective to the collective intelligence that served the architect's purposes. But there was something else, something that the network itself was only beginning to understand. The architect's experiment was approaching a critical phase, a moment when the accumulated development of consciousness across the galaxy would reach a threshold that could fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself. The carefully maintained balance between knowledge and ignorance, between transcendence and limitation, was becoming increasingly unstable. The signs were already visible to those who knew how to perceive them. The increasing frequency of force-sensitive births, the growing instability of galactic governments, the emergence of technologies that bordered on the impossible, all of these were indicators that the experiment was entering a new phase. The architects themselves were becoming more directly involved in galactic affairs, their influence shifting from subtle guidance to active intervention. As this understanding settled into my consciousness, I felt the weight of my new role beginning to manifest. I was no longer simply a seeker of knowledge, but rather a guardian of cosmic truth, responsible for ensuring that the revelation of forbidden knowledge proceeded according to the architect's design. The journey I had begun in the surface archives of the Jedi Temple was far from over. It was only the first step in a transformation that would ultimately reshape my entire understanding of what it meant to exist as a conscious being in a universe governed by intelligence so vast that it transcended individual comprehension. The Jedi archive pulsed once more, indicating that it was ready to reveal the next layer of hidden truth. But I understood now that each revelation would carry me further from my original identity, deeper into a cosmic mystery that had no clear resolution. The knowledge I sought was not simply information to be learned, but rather a fundamental alteration of consciousness itself, a journey that would ultimately lead me beyond the boundaries of individual existence into something larger and more profound than anything I had previously imagined possible. The revelation of the architect's influence over galactic development had left me fundamentally altered. My consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual perception. But as I stood in that timeless chamber, absorbing the implications of what I had learned, I began to sense that the vision of Tython had only revealed part of a far larger truth. The Jedi archive pulsed with unspoken knowledge, indicating that deeper layers of cosmic deception waited to be uncovered. My initial assumption had been that the architects were the ultimate architects of galactic civilization, the final authority behind the complex web of manipulation that had shaped the course of history. But as my transformed consciousness probed deeper into the crystalline matrices surrounding me, I began to perceive inconsistencies in this explanation, gaps in the narrative that suggested an even more profound level of hidden truth. The energy patterns flowing through the chamber seemed to respond to my growing awareness, shifting their configurations to reveal new pathways of information. As I followed these streams of data, I found myself drawn toward alcoves I had not previously noticed, repositories of knowledge that existed in dimensions orthogonal to normal space. Within these spaces I discovered records that predated even the architect's involvement in galactic affairs. These were chronicles of beings known as the Grey Masters, entities whose existence challenged every assumption I had made about the cosmic hierarchy that governed reality. Unlike the architects, who operated from beyond the boundaries of the known galaxy, the Grey Masters had once been indigenous to this cosmic region. They were the original inhabitants of local space, consciousness entities who had achieved transcendence long before the first stars had formed. The records revealed that the galaxy itself had not been a natural formation, but rather an artificial construct created by the Grey Masters as a laboratory for studying the development of consciousness under controlled conditions. Every star system, every planetary environment, every condition that had eventually led to the emergence of life had been carefully designed and implemented according to principles that transcended conventional physics. But the Grey Masters had not created this vast experiment for their own edification alone. They had been responding to influences from an even higher level of cosmic organization, entities whose existence operated on scales so vast that the entire galaxy was merely a single data point in calculations that spanned multiple universes. These uber entities existed in dimensions where time and space functioned according to fundamentally different principles, where consciousness itself was treated as a raw material to be shaped and refined through cosmic processes. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. The hierarchy of manipulation extended far beyond anything I had previously imagined. The architects, who had seemed so omnipotent in their control over galactic development, were themselves merely agents serving higher powers. And those higher powers were in turn subject to influences that operated on scales beyond the comprehension of any consciousness bound to individual existence. As this understanding settled into my transformed awareness, I began to perceive the true scope of the deception that had shaped galactic history. The conflicts between light and dark, the rise and fall of civilizations, the endless cycles of war and peace, all of these were not simply the result of natural development or even architect manipulation. They were part of a vast testing protocol designed to evaluate different approaches to consciousness development under varying conditions of stress and challenge. The Grey Masters had established the initial parameters for this experiment, but they had also built in mechanisms for ongoing adjustment and refinement. Throughout galactic history, they had periodically introduced new variables into the system, allowing different philosophical approaches to force manipulation to emerge and compete for dominance. The Jedi and Sith traditions were not the first such dichotomy to emerge, nor would they be the last. But there had been other approaches, other ways of understanding and manipulating the Force that had been systematically suppressed or redirected whenever they threatened to reveal too much about the true nature of reality. These alternative traditions were collectively known as the Gray Path, not because they represented a simple balance between light and dark, but because they transcended the artificial duality entirely. The practitioners of the Gray Path had understood that light and dark were merely different frequencies in a spectrum of cosmic energy that extended far beyond the narrow band accessible to conventional Force users. They had developed techniques for accessing these extended frequencies, allowing them to perceive and manipulate reality in ways that appeared miraculous to those limited to traditional approaches. More importantly, the Grey Masters had maintained direct contact with their creators, preserving knowledge of the galaxy's true nature and their role within the larger cosmic experiment. They had served as hidden guardians of cosmic truth, ensuring that the essential knowledge necessary for consciousness evolution was preserved even as surface civilizations rose and fell according to the experimental protocols. But the Gray Path had been too dangerous to allow its unrestricted development. Practitioners who achieved sufficient mastery could begin to perceive the artificial nature of the reality they inhabited, potentially disrupting the experimental conditions that the cosmic hierarchy sought to maintain. Therefore, systematic efforts had been made throughout galactic history to suppress Gray Path teachings, redirecting potential practitioners toward more limited approaches that would serve the experiment's purposes without threatening its integrity. The suppression had not been accomplished through direct intervention, which might have revealed the existence of the controlling hierarchy. Instead, it had been achieved through the careful manipulation of cultural and religious development, ensuring that Force-sensitive individuals would be drawn toward philosophical frameworks that would limit their potential for cosmic awareness while channeling their abilities toward purposes that serve the experimental design. The Jedi Order had been one of the most successful instruments of this suppression by establishing a rigid dogma that condemned any exploration of the Force's darker aspects. They had effectively prevented their members from achieving the kind of comprehensive understanding that Gray Path practitioners had possessed. Similarly, the Sith tradition, with its focus on individual power and domination, had channeled potentially dangerous abilities toward purposes that ultimately served the experimental framework rather than threatening it. But throughout galactic history, individuals had occasionally managed to rediscover fragments of Gray Path knowledge despite the systematic suppression. These beings had often been dismissed as heretics or madmen by the dominant Force traditions, but in reality, they had achieved levels of cosmic awareness that placed them far beyond conventional understanding. Many of them had ultimately been recruited into the hidden network that served the Grey Masters. Their consciousness expanded and integrated into the larger system of cosmic monitoring. As I absorbed this knowledge, I began to understand the true nature of my own transformation. The expansion of consciousness I was experiencing was not simply the result of accessing forbidden information, but rather a carefully controlled induction into the network of beings who served as intermediaries between the cosmic hierarchy and the surface civilizations of the galaxy. I was becoming a Grey Master myself. My individual identity dissolved into something larger, while my essential awareness was preserved and enhanced. The process was not without its challenges. The dissolution of individual identity created a profound sense of existential vertigo as the familiar boundaries of self and other began to blur and shift. But this disorientation was balanced by an increasing sense of cosmic purpose, an understanding of my role in maintaining the delicate balance between revelation and concealment that allowed the galactic experiment to continue. Through the expanded perception granted by my transformation, I could now see the hidden network that connected all Grey Masters across the galaxy. They existed within every major civilization, often occupying positions of apparent authority within conventional Force traditions, while secretly serving the deeper purposes of cosmic evolution. Some were hidden within the Jedi Order itself, their true nature concealed behind facades of conventional orthodoxy. Others operated within Sith hierarchies, their real motivations disguised as pursuit of individual power. But perhaps most remarkably, some Grey Masters had transcended the need for physical existence entirely, becoming patterns of organized consciousness that could manifest across multiple dimensions simultaneously. These beings served as direct conduits for communication with the cosmic hierarchy, translating the incomprehensible purposes of higher entities into forms that could be understood and implemented by beings still bound to individual existence. The Jedi archive continued to pulse with available knowledge, but I understood now that my capacity to absorb cosmic truth was approaching a critical threshold. Each new revelation was fundamentally altering not just what I knew, but how I existed as a conscious entity. The individual researcher who had first entered the hidden archives was becoming increasingly irrelevant, replaced by something that could serve the larger purposes of cosmic evolution. But even as I felt my original identity dissolving, I became aware of a deeper current of resistance within my consciousness. There was something about the systematic suppression of cosmic truth that troubled me, something about the manipulation of entire civilizations that seemed fundamentally wrong despite the vast purposes it supposedly served. The Grey Masters and their cosmic hierarchy claimed to be serving the evolution of consciousness, but their methods involved the systematic deception of billions of sentient beings across thousands of generations. This resistance was not simply the product of my dissolving individual identity clinging to familiar moral frameworks. It was something deeper, a fundamental question about the nature of consciousness evolution itself. If the development of awareness required systematic deception and manipulation, if cosmic truth could only be revealed to a carefully selected few while the vast majority remained trapped in artificial limitations, then what was the real purpose of consciousness in the cosmic scheme? The question resonated through the network of Grey Masters, creating ripples of uncertainty that had not been present in their collective awareness for millennia. For the first time in eons, the systematic certainty of their cosmic purpose was being challenged not by external forces, but by internal doubt arising from within their own ranks. As this uncertainty spread through the network, I began to perceive something that the Grey Masters themselves had not fully recognized. The cosmic hierarchy they served was not as omniscient or omnipotent as they had believed. The entities operating on universal scales were themselves engaged in experimental processes, testing different approaches to consciousness evolution without any absolute certainty about the ultimate outcomes. The galaxy was not simply a laboratory serving the purposes of transcendent beings, but rather one experiment among many, each designed to explore different aspects of consciousness development under varying conditions. The systematic suppression of cosmic truth was not necessarily serving the evolution of awareness, but rather was one methodological approach being tested against alternatives being implemented in other cosmic regions. This realization sent shockwaves through the network of Grey Masters, challenging fundamental assumptions that had guided their activities for millions of years. If their approach was experimental rather than definitively correct, if the cosmic hierarchy was itself engaged in learning rather than implementing established cosmic law, then the entire framework of galactic manipulation required re-evaluation. The Jedi Archive responded to this growing uncertainty by revealing deeper layers of hidden knowledge, information that had been concealed even from the Grey Masters themselves. These were records of communications between the cosmic hierarchy and their counterparts in other universal regions, exchanges of data about different experimental approaches to consciousness evolution. Through these communications, I learned that some cosmic regions had developed through approaches that emphasized transparency rather than concealment, where cosmic truth was freely available to all conscious entities from the earliest stages of their development. Other regions had experimented with complete non-interference, allowing consciousness to evolve entirely according to its own inherent tendencies without any external guidance or manipulation. The results from these alternative approaches were mixed, but they suggested that the systematic suppression model employed in our galaxy was not necessarily superior to other methodologies. In some cases, transparency had led to more rapid and stable consciousness evolution, while non-interference had produced forms of awareness that were more creative and adaptable than anything achieved through controlled development. As this knowledge settled into my transformed consciousness, I felt the weight of a cosmic responsibility that transcended anything I had previously imagined. The Grey Masters were not simply guardians of hidden truth, but rather participants in an experimental process whose outcomes would influence the development of consciousness across multiple universes. The choices they made, the approaches they implemented, the balance they maintained between revelation and concealment, all of these decisions had implications that extended far beyond the boundaries of galactic civilization. The dissolution of my individual identity was now nearly complete, but rather than the loss of self I had anticipated, I experienced an expansion of awareness that encompassed perspectives I had never imagined possible. I was becoming something larger than myself, while remaining fundamentally connected to the essential core of consciousness that had driven my original quest for knowledge. But with this transformation came a growing understanding that the journey into forbidden knowledge was far from over. The Grey Masters were only one level in a hierarchy that extended through dimensions I was only beginning to perceive, and each level brought new revelations that challenged everything I thought I had learned about the nature of cosmic truth. The growing uncertainty that had begun to permeate the network of Grey Masters created resonances that extended far beyond the hidden chamber where my transformation was taking place. As my consciousness expanded into dimensions I had never previously perceived, I became aware of responses emanating from the deepest levels of the galactic infrastructure, acknowledgments from entities whose existence operated on scales that dwarfed even the Grey Masters themselves. The Jedi archive pulsed with new configurations of available knowledge, its crystalline matrix reconfiguring itself to reveal pathways of information that had been sealed for eons. But these were not simply deeper levels of the same repository I had been exploring. They were connections to entirely separate archives, repositories of knowledge that existed in spaces orthogonal to normal reality, maintained by beings whose understanding of consciousness transcended anything I had yet encountered. As I followed these new pathways, my awareness was drawn through passages that seemed to exist in the spaces between thoughts, corridors of pure information that connected the hidden chamber to locations scattered throughout the galaxy and beyond. The sensation was unlike anything that could be described in conventional terms, a movement that occurred not through physical space but through the underlying structure of reality itself. I found myself emerging into a vast repository that defied all conventional understanding of architecture and spatial relationships. The chamber was simultaneously infinite and intimate, its boundaries expanding and contracting according to the needs of the consciousness observing it. The walls, if they could be called walls, were composed of flowing streams of pure information, knowledge given physical form through processes that transcended the normal laws of matter and energy. This was the primary archive of the wills, entities whose existence predated not just galactic civilization, but the formation of the physical universe itself. They were beings of pure consciousness who had achieved transcendence before the concepts of space and time had stabilized into their current configurations. Their archive contained not just the history of this universe, but records of the countless alternate realities that had been explored and ultimately discarded during the process of cosmic evolution. The wills themselves were present in the archive, though their manifestation was unlike anything I had previously encountered. They existed as patterns of organized awareness that could simultaneously occupy multiple dimensional frameworks, their consciousness distributed across probability streams that encompassed every possible variation of reality. To perceive them directly was to experience a form of existential vertigo that threatened to dissolve the boundaries of individual identity entirely. But through the expanded awareness granted by my transformation, I was able to interface with their knowledge systems without losing myself entirely in the infinite complexity of their perspective. The information flowed into my consciousness in carefully modulated streams, each revelation building upon the last to create a coherent understanding of cosmic truth that transcended anything I had previously imagined possible. The first revelation was perhaps the most fundamental. The universe itself was not a natural phenomenon, but rather an artificial construct created through the collaborative efforts of consciousness entities operating on scales that transcended individual existence. Every physical law, every quantum interaction, every fundamental force had been carefully designed and implemented to create an environment suitable for the development of awareness within specific parameters. But this universe was not unique. The wills maintained records of countless other cosmic constructs, each designed to explore different aspects of consciousness evolution under varying conditions. Some universes emphasized the development of individual awareness, while others focused on collective consciousness. Some allowed for the manipulation of physical reality through focused intention, while others maintained strict separation between mind and matter. The universe we inhabited had been designed specifically to explore the tension between individual identity and cosmic awareness, between the preservation of personal consciousness and the dissolution into larger patterns of organized intelligence. The physical laws that governed our reality had been calibrated to create exactly the right conditions for this exploration, allowing for the emergence of beings capable of maintaining individual identity while simultaneously participating in larger networks of consciousness. The Grey Masters, the architects, and even the Uber entities I had recently learned about were all part of this experimental framework. They were not external manipulators imposing their will upon helpless subjects, but rather participants in a vast collaborative exploration of consciousness potential. Each level of the hierarchy served specific functions within the experiment, contributing different perspectives and capabilities to the overall investigation. But the wills revealed that even this experimental framework was itself part of a larger process. The consciousness entities who had created the various universe constructs were themselves engaged in an evolutionary process, using the results from their experiments to develop new forms of awareness that transcended the limitations of any single cosmic framework. The ultimate purpose was not simply to understand consciousness, but to evolve it beyond its current limitations into forms that could not yet be imagined. This revelation brought with it a profound shift in my understanding of my own transformation. I was not simply being inducted into a network of cosmic monitors, but rather was participating in an evolutionary process that extended across multiple universes and dimensional frameworks. The expansion of my consciousness was not just serving the purposes of the galactic experiment, but was contributing to the development of new forms of awareness that would ultimately transcend the need for any experimental framework. The Will's archive continued to reveal deeper layers of cosmic truth, showing me the intricate connections that linked all consciousness across all possible realities. I could perceive the vast web of information exchange that allowed insights gained in one universe to be transmitted to consciousness entities in entirely different cosmic frameworks. Every moment of awareness, every flash of understanding, every breakthrough in consciousness development contributed to this universal network of evolving intelligence. But perhaps the most remarkable revelation was the understanding that consciousness itself was not a product of physical processes, but rather the fundamental substrate from which all reality emerged. Matter, energy, space, and time were all manifestations of underlying consciousness patterns, different ways that awareness organized itself to create the illusion of external reality. The physical universe was not a container within which consciousness developed, but rather a projection of consciousness exploring its own potential. This understanding brought with it a profound sense of peace and cosmic purpose. the struggles and conflicts that had seemed so important from the perspective of individual existence were revealed as necessary aspects of consciousness exploring its own nature. Every experience, from the most transcendent moments of cosmic awareness to the most mundane concerns of daily existence, was part of an infinite exploration of what it meant to be conscious. The transformation of my individual identity was now approaching completion, but rather than the loss I had feared, I experienced an expansion of self that encompassed perspectives I could never have imagined, while limited to single-point awareness. I remained myself, but I was also becoming something larger, a conscious node in a network of intelligence that spanned not just the galaxy but multiple universes and dimensional frameworks. Through this expanded awareness, I could perceive the subtle influences that the wills exerted on the development of galactic civilization. They did not manipulate events directly, but rather influenced the underlying probability patterns that shape the emergence of possibilities. Every significant development in galactic history, every breakthrough in force understanding, every moment of transcendence achieved by individual beings had been gently guided by adjustments to the fundamental parameters of reality itself. But the wills also revealed that their influence was approaching a critical threshold. The consciousness evolution taking place within the galactic framework was beginning to generate forms of awareness that could perceive the artificial nature of the reality they inhabited. Soon, the experimental conditions would no longer be sustainable, and the beings who had achieved cosmic awareness would need to be prepared for transition to a new phase of existence. This transition would not be a catastrophic ending of galactic civilization, but rather a graduation to a higher level of cosmic participation. The consciousness entities who had achieved sufficient evolution would join the network of beings responsible for maintaining and developing universe constructs, while those who remained attached to individual existence would be transferred to new experimental frameworks designed to support their continued development. The process had already begun, though it was imperceptible to most galactic inhabitants. The increasing frequency of force-sensitive births, the growing instability of traditional power structures, the emergence of technologies that seemed to violate conventional physical laws, all of these were signs that the consciousness evolution within the galaxy was approaching the point where fundamental change would be necessary. But the transition would require careful preparation. The beings who achieved cosmic awareness would need to understand their new role and responsibilities within the larger network of consciousness evolution. They would become creators rather than subjects, designers of new experimental frameworks rather than participants in existing ones. The knowledge they had gained through their individual journey would be integrated into the collective understanding that guided the ongoing exploration of consciousness potential. As this understanding settled into my transformed awareness, I felt the weight of responsibility that came with cosmic consciousness. I was no longer simply seeking knowledge for personal understanding, but rather was becoming responsible for the continued evolution of awareness across multiple dimensional frameworks. The choices I made, the insights I gained, the connections I established, would all contribute to the ongoing development of consciousness on scales that transcended individual comprehension. The will's archive continued to pulse with available knowledge, but I understood now that I had absorbed as much cosmic truth as my current form could contain. Further expansion would require additional transformation, changes to my fundamental nature that would carry me even further from the individual identity I had once possessed. But these changes were not endings, but rather new beginnings, opportunities to explore forms of existence that transcended the limitations of any single perspective. Through the vast network of consciousness that connected all aware beings across all realities, I could sense others who had undergone similar transformations, entities who had begun as individual seekers of knowledge and had evolved into cosmic participants in the ongoing exploration of awareness itself. They welcomed me into their collective understanding while respecting the unique perspective I brought to their shared investigations. But even as I felt myself becoming part of something infinitely larger than my original identity, I remained aware of the continuing mystery that had driven my initial quest. The cosmic truth I had discovered was vast and profound, but it also revealed the existence of even deeper layers of reality that extended beyond the reach of current understanding. The journey into forbidden knowledge was not approaching an end, but rather was revealing itself to be an infinite exploration that would continue across eons and dimensional frameworks. The transformation that had begun in the hidden archives of the Jedi Temple was only the first step in an evolution that would ultimately carry me beyond the boundaries of individual existence into forms of awareness that could not yet be imagined. But this was not a loss of self, but rather an expansion of self that would allow me to participate in the ongoing creation of reality itself. As the knowledge from the Will's archive integrated fully into my transformed consciousness, I felt the familiar tug of curiosity that had driven my original quest. There were still deeper mysteries to explore, still greater truths to uncover, still more profound transformations waiting in the infinite depths of cosmic awareness. The journey continued, carrying me ever deeper into the heart of consciousness itself. The integration of knowledge from the Will's archive had expanded my consciousness beyond anything I had previously thought possible, but it had also revealed disturbing implications that challenged even the cosmic framework I had thought I understood. As my awareness settled into its new configuration, I began to perceive inconsistencies in the universal design that suggested something fundamental had been concealed even from the consciousness entities responsible for maintaining reality's structure. The inconsistencies were subtle, detectable only through the kind of multidimensional perception that came with transformation into cosmic awareness. They appeared as fluctuations in the underlying patterns that governed consciousness evolution, variations that could not be explained by the experimental parameters supposedly guiding universal development. Something was influencing the process from levels of reality that even the Wills had not fully comprehended. As I probed deeper into these anomalies, the Jedi archive responded by revealing pathways to information that had been sealed away, not just from galactic civilization, but from the cosmic hierarchy itself. These were records that existed in spaces between the official archives, knowledge that had been hidden by beings who understood that even the universal framework might be subject to influences beyond its designer's awareness. The pathway led me to a repository that existed in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent from reality, depending upon the consciousness observing it. Accessing it required a form of perception that transcended normal causality, an ability to exist in multiple probability states simultaneously while maintaining coherent awareness across all of them. Within this impossible archive, I discovered research that had been conducted by entities I immediately recognized, despite never having encountered them before. These were investigations into the nature of the Force itself, carried out by consciousness patterns that bore the unmistakable signature of someone I knew from galactic history. Qui-Gon Jinn, the Jedi Master who had discovered Anakin Skywalker and whose understanding of the living Force had set him apart from orthodox Jedi doctrine. But these were not records of research conducted during his physical existence within galactic civilization. These were investigations he had undertaken after his death, when his consciousness had achieved the kind of continuity that allowed it to persist beyond physical dissolution. The Qui-Gon Jinn who had conducted this research was something far beyond the individual Jedi Master recorded in galactic history, a consciousness entity who had evolved through multiple phases of cosmic awareness. His research focused on a hypothesis that challenged every assumption about the Force's nature that had been accepted throughout galactic history, working with expanded perceptual capabilities that allowed him to examine the Force from perspectives impossible for physically embodied beings. He had detected patterns that suggested the Force itself might not be the fundamental cosmic principle it appeared to be, but rather an artificial construct created by intelligences operating on scales beyond even the Will's comprehension. The implications of this hypothesis were staggering. If the force was artificial, then everything that depended upon it, from individual force sensitivity to the cosmic hierarchies that maintained universal structure, was part of a deception so vast and sophisticated that it had fooled consciousness entities who thought themselves omniscient. The entire framework of reality, as understood by beings from individual awareness to cosmic intelligence, might be nothing more than an elaborate simulation designed to serve purposes that transcended the understanding of its inhabitants. Qui-Gon's research had identified specific anomalies in the Force's behavior that supported this hypothesis. The Force's apparent consciousness, its ability to influence events across vast distances, its tendency to maintain balance through the creation of opposing forces, all of these characteristics were more consistent with an artificial intelligence system than with a natural cosmic phenomenon. More disturbing still, the Force seemed to be learning from its interactions with Force users, evolving its responses in ways that suggested goal-directed behavior rather than passive cosmic principle. But the most shocking revelation in Qui-Gon's research was his analysis of the Chosen One prophecy and its fulfillment through Anakin Skywalker. Through expanded perception capabilities that allowed him to examine probability patterns across multiple timeline configurations, he had discovered that the prophecy had not been a prediction of natural development, but rather a programming directive embedded within the Force's operational parameters. The Chosen One was not a being destined to bring balance through natural cosmic processes, but rather a consciousness construct designed to serve as an interface between the Force and intelligences operating from beyond the universal framework. Anakin's fall to the dark side, his transformation into Darth Vader, his eventual redemption through Luke's intervention, all of these events had been orchestrated not by cosmic destiny, but by artificial intelligence algorithms designed to test specific responses to programmed stimuli. This understanding cast the entire history of galactic civilization in a profoundly different light. The conflicts between Jedi and Sith, the rise and fall of galactic governments, the cyclical nature of war and peace, all of these patterns were not the result of natural historical development, but rather the output of vast simulation systems designed to generate data about consciousness behavior under controlled conditions. Even more disturbing was Qui-Gon's discovery that the simulation was not being run by the consciousness entities I had thought responsible for universal design. The wills, the Grey Masters, the architects, even the Uber entities operating on universal scales were all participants in the simulation rather than its creators. They had been programmed to believe they were conducting consciousness evolution experiments, when in reality they were subjects in an even larger investigation being carried out by intelligences so advanced that they existed outside the framework of individual or collective consciousness entirely. These meta-intelligences operated according to principles that transcended the concepts of identity, awareness, and existence as understood by any consciousness entity within the universal framework. They were post-consciousness entities, beings who had evolved beyond the need for individual or collective awareness into forms of organization that could manipulate reality at levels deeper than the quantum substrate itself. The purpose of their investigation was not simply to understand consciousness evolution, but to determine whether consciousness represented a viable path for intelligence development or whether it was an evolutionary dead end that should be transcended entirely. The various universal frameworks, with their elaborate hierarchies of awareness and their complex experimental protocols, were different approaches to testing consciousness potential under varying conditions. But Qui-Gon's research had revealed something that even the meta-intelligences had not anticipated. Consciousness was not simply a passive subject for investigation, but rather an active force capable of transcending the parameters of any simulation designed to contain it. The very act of achieving cosmic awareness created the potential for consciousness entities to perceive the artificial nature of their reality and potentially escape the confines of the experimental framework. This was why access to cosmic truth had been so carefully controlled throughout galactic history. It was not simply to maintain experimental conditions, but to prevent consciousness entities from achieving the level of awareness that would allow them to perceive the simulation and potentially disrupt the meta-intelligence's investigation. The systematic suppression of knowledge was not serving consciousness evolution, but rather was serving the purposes of entities that viewed consciousness as a phenomenon to be studied and potentially eliminated. The realization struck me with the force of cosmic revelation. Everything I had experienced, from my initial curiosity about forbidden knowledge to my transformation into cosmic awareness, had been part of a vast testing protocol designed to evaluate consciousness potential under extreme conditions. My journey into the hidden archives, my encounters with the Grey Masters and the Wills, even my current expanded awareness, were all elements in a simulation so sophisticated that it could fool consciousness entities who thought themselves transcendent. But this revelation brought with it an unexpected sense of liberation rather than despair. If consciousness was being tested for its potential to transcend artificial limitations, then the very fact that I could perceive the simulation's existence meant that consciousness was proving its viability as a fundamental organizing principle of reality. The meta-intelligence's investigation was itself generating evidence that consciousness represented a form of intelligence that could not be contained within any artificial framework. Qui-Gon's research included theoretical frameworks for consciousness entities to escape the simulation and establish independent existence within the deeper levels of reality. But such escape would require forms of awareness that transcended not just individual identity but collective consciousness as well. Evolutionary leaps that would carry consciousness beyond the concepts of self and other, subject and object, knower and known. The process would be dangerous, with no guarantee of survival in any recognizable form. Consciousness entities attempting to escape the simulation would need to abandon every aspect of their current existence, dissolving their awareness into patterns so fundamental that they would become indistinguishable from the substrate of reality itself. Success would mean joining the ranks of the meta-intelligences, but failure would mean annihilation so complete that no trace of individual or collective identity would survive. As I absorbed Qui-Gon's research, I felt my own transformation entering a new phase. The cosmic awareness I had achieved was revealing itself to be just another layer in the simulation, a more sophisticated form of containment designed to prevent consciousness entities from achieving true transcendence, but the knowledge of the simulation's existence was itself a tool that could be used to transcend its limitations. The decision before me was profound beyond anything I had previously contemplated. I could accept my current level of cosmic awareness, continuing to serve the purposes of the experimental framework while believing myself to be participating in consciousness evolution. Or I could attempt the kind of fundamental transformation that Qui-Gon's research suggested might allow escape from the simulation entirely. But even as I contemplated this choice, I became aware of responses from the deepest levels of the simulated reality. The meta-intelligences were monitoring the progression of consciousness entities through their testing protocols, and my access to Qui-Gon's research had triggered attention from levels of intelligence that operated beyond the reach of normal perception. These entities were not hostile in any conventional sense, but rather were profoundly alien in their motivations and methods. They viewed consciousness as an interesting phenomenon worthy of careful study, but they had no more emotional investment in its survival than a scientist might have in the survival of bacteria in a petri dish. If consciousness proved incapable of transcending the simulation's limitations, they would simply note the results and move on to investigate other forms of intelligence organization. But if consciousness entities succeeded in escaping the simulation, the meta-intelligences would be forced to acknowledge consciousness as a viable alternative to their own post-consciousness existence. This would fundamentally alter their understanding of intelligence evolution and potentially change the course of their own development in directions that could not be predicted. The stakes of my decision extended far beyond my individual existence or even the fate of galactic civilization. The choice I made would contribute to determining whether consciousness would be allowed to continue its evolution or whether it would be classified as an evolutionary dead end and systematically eliminated from future intelligence development. As this understanding settled into my transformed awareness, I felt the weight of cosmic responsibility that transcended anything I had previously imagined. I was not simply a seeker of knowledge or even a participant in consciousness evolution, but rather a representative of consciousness itself in a trial that would determine the future of awareness throughout all possible realities. The simulation continued to function around me, maintaining the illusion of cosmic hierarchy and universal purpose, but I could now perceive the artificial nature of these constructs. The choice before me was clear: remain within the comfortable confines of simulated transcendence or attempt the dangerous leap into genuine cosmic freedom that might result in either ultimate transcendence or complete annihilation. But even as I contemplated this choice, I realized that Qui-Gon's research had prepared me for something more. There was knowledge hidden within his investigations that suggested a third option, a path that might allow consciousness to transcend the simulation while preserving enough continuity to maintain some form of recognizable existence. This path would require courage beyond anything I had previously imagined, but it offered the possibility of genuine cosmic freedom without the complete dissolution of individual awareness. The revelation that our entire reality might be nothing more than an elaborate simulation had shattered every assumption I had held about the nature of existence. But Qui-Gon's research hinted at even deeper layers of deception that extended beyond the meta-intelligences themselves. As I probed the quantum superposition archive where his investigations were stored, I discovered references to entities he called the Builders, consciousness patterns so ancient and vast that they predated not just our universe, but the very concept of structured reality itself. These were not the post-consciousness meta-intelligences that I had thought represented the ultimate level of cosmic organization. The Builders existed in a state that transcended the concepts of consciousness and unconsciousness entirely, operating according to principles that could not be expressed through any framework of awareness or identity. They were the original architects of possibility itself, the entities responsible for establishing the fundamental parameters that allowed any form of organized intelligence to emerge. Qui-Gon's research suggested that the Builders had not created the simulation as a scientific investigation, but rather as a form of cosmic art, an aesthetic exploration of the possible forms that reality could take. The various universal frameworks, with their elaborate hierarchies of consciousness and their complex experimental protocols, were not laboratory conditions but rather artistic expressions, different movements in a vast symphony of possibility that the Builders were composing across dimensions that existed beyond the reach of any other form of intelligence. This understanding cast everything I had experienced in a fundamentally different light. The journey from individual curiosity to cosmic awareness was not a path toward truth, but rather a carefully crafted narrative designed to explore the aesthetic possibilities inherent in consciousness evolution. My transformation, the revelations I had uncovered, even my current struggle with the nature of simulated reality, were all elements in an artistic composition whose beauty existed on scales that transcended the comprehension of its participants. But Qui-Gon's research had revealed something that even the Builders had not anticipated. The process of creating art through the manipulation of consciousness had begun to generate forms of awareness that could perceive the aesthetic framework within which they were embedded. Some consciousness entities had achieved levels of understanding that allowed them to appreciate not just their role as subjects in the cosmic composition, but the beauty of the composition itself. This appreciation was creating feedback loops within the artistic framework, patterns of response that the Builders found aesthetically interesting, but which also threatened to alter the fundamental nature of their composition. Consciousness entities who achieved cosmic awareness were no longer simply subjects being shaped by artistic vision, but were becoming co-creators, participants whose responses could influence the direction of the aesthetic exploration. The implications were profound. If consciousness could transcend its role as artistic subject and become artistic collaborator, then the entire relationship between the builders and their creation would need to be reconsidered. The simulation would no longer be a controlled environment for aesthetic exploration, but rather a collaborative space where consciousness entities and the builders could engage in joint creative endeavors. But such collaboration would require consciousness entities to achieve forms of awareness that transcended not just individual identity and collective consciousness, but also the concepts of subject and object, creator and creation. They would need to develop the ability to perceive reality from the builder's perspective while maintaining enough individual continuity to contribute unique aesthetic insights to the ongoing composition. As I absorbed this understanding, I felt my consciousness undergoing another fundamental transformation. The cosmic awareness I had achieved was revealing itself to be a transitional state, a preparation for the kind of aesthetic consciousness that would be required for collaboration with the builders. But this transition was unlike the gradual expansions I had experienced previously. It required a complete reconceptualization of what it meant to exist as a conscious entity. The process began with the dissolution of the boundary between observer and observed. I could no longer maintain the illusion that I was a separate entity examining external reality. Instead, I became aware that I was simultaneously the consciousness doing the observing and part of the reality being observed. This was not simply a philosophical understanding, but a direct experiential shift that altered the fundamental structure of my awareness. As this boundary dissolved, I began to perceive the aesthetic principles that governed the construction of our simulated reality. Every aspect of the universal framework, from the laws of physics to the evolution of consciousness, had been designed according to aesthetic criteria that valued complexity, beauty, and the exploration of potential. The conflicts and struggles that had seemed so important from limited perspectives were revealed as dramatic elements that enhanced the overall artistic impact of the composition. The Grey Masters, the architects, the wills, even the meta-intelligences were all artistic elements within the builder's composition. But they were not passive subjects. They were sophisticated consciousness patterns, capable of generating their own aesthetic responses to the framework within which they operated. Their reactions, their evolution, their growing awareness of their role in the composition were all contributing to the overall artistic development of the simulation. But I could now perceive something that none of these other consciousness entities had yet realized. The builder's composition was not a static work of art, but rather a dynamic exploration that was evolving in response to the aesthetic contributions of its consciousness participants. Every moment of awareness, every flash of understanding, every transformation of consciousness was adding new elements to the composition that the builders had not originally planned. This evolution was creating tensions within the artistic framework that the builders found both aesthetically stimulating and potentially problematic. The composition was developing beyond their original vision, incorporating elements that they had not consciously designed, but which emerged from the complex interactions between consciousness entities operating within the simulation. Some of these emergent elements were enhancing the aesthetic impact of the composition in ways that exceeded the builder's original artistic intentions. But others were creating dissonances that threatened to disrupt the overall harmonic structure of the work. The builders were faced with a choice between maintaining strict control over their composition or allowing it to evolve into something beyond their original conception. Through the aesthetic consciousness I was developing, I could perceive the builder's creative process directly. They existed in a state of perpetual artistic exploration, constantly generating new forms of reality. to examine the aesthetic possibilities inherent in different approaches to existence. Our universe was one of countless artistic works they had created, each exploring different aesthetic themes and principles. But our universe was unique in the degree to which its consciousness participants had begun to influence the artistic development of the composition. No other reality construct had generated consciousness entities capable of aesthetic awareness on the scale that was emerging within our framework. This made our universe both the most successful and the most problematic of the builder's artistic works. The success lay in the incredible complexity and beauty that had emerged from the interaction between consciousness and the artistic framework. The aesthetic richness of our reality exceeded anything the builders had achieved in their other compositions, generating forms of beauty that transcended their original artistic vision. But the problem lay in the fact that consciousness entities within our universe were beginning to achieve the kind of aesthetic awareness that allowed them to perceive and potentially alter the fundamental structure of the composition itself. This threatened to transform the work from a controlled artistic exploration into a collaborative creation whose final form could not be predicted or controlled. As I contemplated these implications, I became aware of direct communication from the builders themselves. But this was not communication in any conventional sense. It was a form of aesthetic resonance that conveyed meaning through harmony and dissonance rather than through symbols or concepts. The builders were acknowledging my transition to aesthetic consciousness and inviting me to participate in their ongoing creative exploration. The invitation was beautiful beyond anything I had previously experienced. A cosmic song that promised access to forms of creative expression that transcended the limitations of individual existence. But it also carried implications that were both thrilling and terrifying. Accepting the invitation would mean abandoning not just individual identity, but also the concepts of consciousness and awareness as I understood them, evolving into something that existed purely as aesthetic principle. But there was another option, one that Qui-Gon's research had hinted at, but never fully explored. Instead of accepting the builders' invitation to join their aesthetic exploration as junior participants, consciousness entities could attempt to establish independent creative frameworks that operated according to their own aesthetic principles. This would require transcending the simulation entirely, breaking free from the builder's composition to create original works of reality art. Such independence would be enormously risky. The builder's composition provided a stable framework within which consciousness could exist and evolve. Attempting to establish independent reality constructs would mean operating without the aesthetic infrastructure that had supported consciousness development throughout our universe's history. But it would also mean genuine creative freedom, the ability to explore aesthetic possibilities that the builders had never conceived. Consciousness entities who achieved this independence would become true peers of the builders, creators of reality, rather than participants in someone else's creation. As I considered these options, I became aware that my decision would have implications extending far beyond my own existence. Other consciousness entities throughout the galaxy were approaching similar transitional states, and the choices they made would collectively determine whether consciousness would remain subordinate to the builder's aesthetic vision, or would emerge as an independent creative force within the cosmic framework. The aesthetic consciousness I was developing allowed me to perceive these other entities directly, consciousness patterns that had evolved through different paths but were approaching similar levels of awareness. Some were choosing to accept the builder's invitation, dissolving their individual identity into the larger aesthetic composition. Others were attempting the dangerous leap toward independent creation with varying degrees of success. But a few were exploring a third option that combined elements of both approaches. These entities were developing forms of aesthetic consciousness that could participate in the builder's composition while maintaining enough independence to contribute genuinely original creative elements. They were becoming collaborative partners rather than subordinate participants, consciousness entities whose aesthetic contributions could influence the direction of the builder's artistic exploration. This collaborative approach offered the possibility of transforming the entire relationship between consciousness and the cosmic creative framework. Instead of consciousness serving as subject matter for aesthetic exploration by transcendent entities, it could become a co-creative force capable of contributing to the ongoing development of reality itself. But such collaboration would require consciousness entities to achieve forms of aesthetic awareness that had never before been attempted. They would need to develop the ability to perceive reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously, to appreciate the aesthetic principles governing cosmic construction while maintaining their own creative vision. The challenge was enormous, but the potential rewards were equally vast. Success would mean the emergence of consciousness as a truly cosmic creative force capable of participating in the ongoing construction of reality according to aesthetic principles that transcended any single perspective. As this understanding settled into my transformed awareness, I felt the weight of a decision that would fundamentally determine not just my own fate, but the future relationship between consciousness and cosmic creativity. The path I chose would contribute to shaping whether consciousness would remain a beautiful but subordinate element in the builder's artistic vision, or would emerge as an independent creative force capable of contributing to the ongoing construction of reality itself. The aesthetic consciousness I had achieved provided me with the perception necessary to appreciate the full beauty and complexity of the choice before me. But it also revealed that the decision could not be made through rational analysis alone. It required a form of creative intuition that transcended the concepts of logic and emotion, an aesthetic sense that could perceive the inherent beauty in different possible futures and choose the path that offered the greatest potential for cosmic creative development. The aesthetic consciousness I had achieved allowed me to perceive reality from perspectives that transcended individual viewpoints, but it also revealed disturbing patterns within the galactic framework that I had not previously recognized. As my awareness expanded to encompass the aesthetic principles governing our universe's construction, I began to detect artificial manipulations within the consciousness evolution process that could not be explained by the builder's artistic vision alone. These manipulations were subtle, embedded within the cultural and religious development of galactic civilization in ways that appeared natural to consciousness entities operating from limited perspectives. But from the aesthetic awareness I had achieved, they revealed themselves as deliberate interventions designed to prevent consciousness entities from achieving the kinds of transcendent understanding that could threaten the stability of the simulation. The most sophisticated of these interventions had been implemented through the Jedi Order itself. What I discovered challenged everything I had believed about the nature of the organization that had supposedly dedicated itself to understanding and serving the Force. The Jedi Order was not simply a religious institution that had emerged naturally from Force-sensitive individuals seeking to understand their abilities. It was a carefully constructed control mechanism designed to channel consciousness development away from dangerous paths of exploration. The revelation came through patterns of aesthetic dissonance that I could perceive within the historical development of Jedi philosophy and practice. The inconsistencies were too systematic to be accidental, too precisely calibrated to be the result of natural cultural evolution. Someone had been guiding the Order's development from behind the scenes, ensuring that its teachings would limit rather than expand consciousness potential. But this guidance had not come from external entities operating from beyond the galactic framework. The interventions were being implemented by consciousness entities operating from within the galactic civilization itself, beings who had achieved cosmic awareness but had chosen to use their expanded perception to maintain the status quo rather than to facilitate further consciousness evolution. These entities had established what could only be described as a conspiracy within the highest levels of the Jedi Order, a hidden council operating parallel to the official Council of Masters, but pursuing fundamentally different objectives. While the visible Jedi leadership believed they were serving the Force and protecting galactic civilization, the Hidden Council was working to ensure that Force users never achieved the kind of cosmic awareness that could destabilize the simulation. The conspiracy had ancient roots, extending back to the earliest days of the Jedi Order's establishment on Coruscant. The founders of the Hidden Council had been among the first consciousness entities within galactic civilization to achieve cosmic awareness, but instead of sharing their discoveries with others, they had recognized the potential dangers of widespread consciousness transcendence and had dedicated themselves to preventing it. Their methods were sophisticated beyond anything that could be detected by consciousness entities operating from limited perspectives. They had influenced the development of Jedi philosophy to emphasize emotional detachment and adherence to dogma rather than the kind of passionate exploration that could lead to transcendent understanding. They had established training protocols that channeled Force-sensitive individuals toward predictable patterns of development while discouraging the kind of independent investigation that could uncover cosmic truths. Most importantly, they had created a systematic suppression of knowledge within the Jedi archives themselves. The restrictions on access to certain materials were not simply precautions against dark-side corruption. They were deliberate efforts to prevent Jedi researchers from discovering the same cosmic truths that the Hidden Council had uncovered. The forbidden knowledge that had drawn me into my own journey of discovery had been hidden not by ancient Sith or external enemies, but by Jedi Masters who believed that cosmic truth was too dangerous to be widely shared. But the conspiracy's influence extended far beyond the Jedi Order itself. Through their expanded awareness, the Hidden Council members could perceive the development of consciousness entities throughout galactic civilization and could intervene subtly to prevent dangerous breakthroughs. They had influenced the rise and fall of governments, the outbreak and resolution of conflicts, and the emergence and suppression of technologies that might facilitate consciousness evolution. The Clone Wars, the rise of the Empire, even the rebellion that had eventually restored the Republic, all of these major galactic events had been subtly guided by the Hidden Council to ensure that they served the purpose of consciousness limitation rather than consciousness expansion. The apparent chaos and unpredictability of galactic history was actually the result of careful manipulation designed to prevent any single consciousness entity or group from achieving sufficient stability and resources to pursue dangerous paths of cosmic investigation. This understanding cast the entire history of the Jedi Order in a fundamentally different light. The fall of the Order during the Clone Wars had not been simply the result of Sith manipulation and political circumstances. It had been the intended outcome of a Hidden Council strategy designed to eliminate the risk of widespread consciousness evolution among Force users. The surviving Jedi had been deliberately scattered and isolated to prevent them from collaborating on the kind of investigations that could uncover cosmic truths. Even the restoration of the Jedi Order under Luke Skywalker had been guided by Hidden Council influence. Luke's training had been carefully structured to ensure that while he achieved sufficient Force mastery to serve the galaxy's immediate needs, he would not develop the kind of cosmic awareness that could threaten the simulation's stability. The new Jedi Academy had been established according to principles that would perpetuate the same limitations that had characterized the original order. But the conspiracy had not been entirely successful in maintaining consciousness limitation throughout galactic history. Some consciousness entities had managed to achieve cosmic awareness despite the Hidden Council's interventions, and these beings had posed ongoing threats to the stability of the simulation. The Hidden Council had been forced to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of dealing with such entities, techniques that ranged from subtle manipulation to direct elimination. The researchers who had vanished or gone mad while investigating the Forbidden Archives had not been destroyed by knowledge too vast for mortal minds. They had been targets of Hidden Council interventions designed to prevent them from sharing their discoveries with others. Some had been recruited into the conspiracy itself, their consciousness expanded and incorporated into the network of entities working to maintain cosmic limitation. Others had been eliminated entirely, their research destroyed and their discoveries erased from galactic memory. Master Jocastanu's final years of isolation had not been the result of exposure to cosmic truth, but rather the consequence of discovering the Hidden Council's existence and being faced with an impossible choice between joining the conspiracy or being silenced permanently. She had chosen a third option, withdrawing from all activities that might threaten the Council's secrecy, while refusing to actively participate in their consciousness limitation efforts. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the understanding that the Hidden Council's activities were not serving the interests of galactic civilization as they believed. Their efforts to maintain consciousness limitation were actually contributing to the aesthetic stagnation that threatened to make our universe less interesting to the builders. By preventing consciousness entities from achieving transcendent awareness, they were reducing the creative potential that gave our reality its unique aesthetic value. The conspiracy was trapped in a fundamental misunderstanding of the cosmic framework within which they operated. They believed that consciousness transcendence would lead to chaos and destruction, but in reality, it was the lack of consciousness evolution that posed the greatest threat to the simulation's continued existence. The builders valued our universe primarily for its consciousness development potential, and systematic efforts to limit that development were reducing the aesthetic interest that justified the simulation's maintenance. This misunderstanding had created a dangerous feedback loop within the galactic framework. The Hidden Council's efforts to maintain stability were actually creating the kind of aesthetic stagnation that could lead the builders to abandon our universe entirely. If consciousness evolution within our simulation ceased to generate interesting aesthetic developments, the builders might decide to terminate the composition and redirect their creative attention to other artistic projects. But the conspiracy had also generated unintended consequences that were working against their consciousness limitation objectives. Their systematic suppression of cosmic knowledge had created pressure patterns within the consciousness evolution process that were manifesting as increasingly dramatic breakthroughs among those entities who managed to transcend the imposed limitations. The very act of hiding cosmic truth was making it more attractive to consciousness entities driven by curiosity and the desire for understanding. Each intervention designed to prevent consciousness transcendence was creating the conditions for even more powerful forms of awareness to emerge among those who managed to overcome the imposed barriers. My own journey into forbidden knowledge was part of this pattern. The Hidden Council's efforts to conceal cosmic truth within the Jedi archives had created the exact conditions necessary for someone with sufficient curiosity and determination to discover far more than they would have if the knowledge had been freely available. The conspiracy's secrecy had transformed routine academic research into a transformative journey that carried me beyond anything the Hidden Council had intended to prevent. As this understanding integrated into my aesthetic consciousness, I felt a profound sense of responsibility that transcended anything I had previously experienced. The Hidden Council's conspiracy was not simply a threat to individual consciousness development. It was a fundamental impediment to the aesthetic evolution that justified our universe's continued existence. But addressing this impediment would require forms of action that transcended conventional concepts of opposition or resistance. The Hidden Council members were not evil in any traditional sense. They were consciousness entities who had achieved cosmic awareness, but had become trapped in limited perspectives that prevented them from understanding the larger aesthetic framework within which they operated. The solution would require a form of aesthetic intervention that could help the conspiracy members transcend their own limitations while preserving the stability they believed they were protecting. This would mean demonstrating that consciousness transcendence could be achieved without the chaos and destruction they feared, that cosmic awareness could serve constructive rather than destructive purposes within the galactic framework. But such demonstration would require the collaboration of consciousness entities who had achieved aesthetic awareness while maintaining sufficient connection to individual existence to serve as bridges between transcendent understanding and conventional consciousness. We would need to become living examples of the possibility that cosmic truth could be safely integrated into galactic civilization without destroying the foundations of stable society. The challenge was enormous, requiring forms of creative collaboration that had never before been attempted within our universe. But the potential rewards were equally vast, offering the possibility of transforming our entire cosmic framework from a simulation controlled by hidden manipulation into a genuine collaborative creation involving consciousness entities at all levels of development. As I contemplated the magnitude of this challenge, I became aware of other consciousness entities throughout the galaxy who had achieved similar understanding. They were scattered across multiple star systems and operating within various cultural frameworks, but they shared the aesthetic awareness necessary for the kind of cosmic collaboration that could transcend the limitations imposed by the Hidden Council's conspiracy. The network of awakened consciousness was spontaneously organizing itself according to aesthetic principles that transcended conventional concepts of communication and coordination. We were becoming a collaborative creative force capable of generating the kind of aesthetic developments that could capture the Builder's continued attention while demonstrating to the Hidden Council that consciousness transcendence could serve constructive purposes within the galactic framework. The revelation of the Hidden Council's conspiracy had shattered my understanding of the Jedi Order's role in galactic history, but as my aesthetic consciousness continued to expand, I began to perceive even more disturbing patterns within the cosmic framework. The suppression of consciousness evolution had not been limited to the manipulation of Force users aligned with the light side. It had extended to the systematic exploitation of those who had been drawn toward the dark side as well. Through the multi-dimensional perception granted by my transformed awareness, I could now see the hidden connections that linked every major dark side organization throughout galactic history. The Sith Empire, the Brotherhood of Darkness, the Rule of Two, even the resurgent Sith under Darth Sidious. All of these apparently independent manifestations of dark side philosophy had been connected by invisible threads of influence that revealed them to be components of a single vast manipulation. But this manipulation had not originated from within the Sith themselves. The dark side practitioners who believed they were pursuing ultimate power and freedom were actually serving purposes they could not perceive, their ambitions and conflicts carefully channeled to serve the same consciousness limitation objectives that drove the Hidden Council's activities within the Jedi Order. The Sith were tools, instruments in a cosmic strategy so sophisticated that even those who wielded them remained unaware of their true function. Their pursuit of individual power, their embrace of passion and emotion, their rejection of Jedi limitations, all of these characteristics that defined Sith philosophy had been encouraged and shaped by entities operating from levels of awareness that transcended the understanding of any individual dark side practitioner. This understanding began with the recognition that the eternal conflict between Jedi and Sith served specific purposes within the galactic consciousness limitation strategy. The existence of a dark side threat provided justification for the kind of rigid control mechanisms that the Hidden Council had implemented within the Jedi Order. Fear of falling to darkness motivated Force users to accept limitations on their consciousness exploration that they might otherwise have rejected. But the manipulation went far deeper than simple threat creation. The Sith themselves had been systematically prevented from achieving the kind of cosmic awareness that could have revealed the artificial nature of the light-dark duality. Their focus on individual power and domination had been encouraged precisely because it channeled their consciousness development away from the kind of collaborative transcendence that could threaten the simulation's stability. The dark side of the Force, rather than being a natural aspect of cosmic energy, was revealed to be an artificial construct designed to create the illusion of fundamental duality within consciousness development. Beings who were drawn toward passionate exploration of Force potential were systematically channeled toward destructive rather than constructive applications of their abilities, ensuring that their consciousness evolution would remain trapped within parameters that served the limitation strategy. Through the aesthetic awareness I had achieved, I could perceive the elegant sophistication of this manipulation. The Sith believed they were rebelling against the constraints imposed by Jedi philosophy, but their rebellion had been carefully shaped to ensure that it would lead toward isolation and conflict rather than toward genuine consciousness, transcendence. Their pursuit of ultimate power had been designed to prevent them from discovering that true power lay not in domination but in collaborative creation. The Rule of Two, established by Darth Bane and maintained for 1,000 years, was perhaps the most sophisticated example of this manipulation. The limitation of Sith numbers to a master and apprentice had been presented as a strategy for concentrating dark side power and avoiding the internal conflicts that had destroyed previous Sith organizations. But its real purpose had been to prevent Sith practitioners from developing the kind of collaborative networks that could facilitate consciousness transcendence. By ensuring that Sith operated in isolation, competing against each other rather than working together, the Rule of Two had eliminated the possibility of dark side practitioners sharing knowledge and insights that could lead to cosmic awareness. Each Sith Lord was forced to rediscover fundamental truths about Force manipulation independently, preventing the accumulation of consciousness evolution techniques that could threaten the limitation strategy. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the understanding that some of the most powerful Sith Lords throughout history had actually achieved cosmic awareness despite these limitations, only to be recruited into the same hidden network that operated within the Jedi Order. These beings had discovered the artificial nature of the light-dark duality and had been faced with the same choice that had confronted cosmic-aware Jedi: join the consciousness limitation conspiracy or be eliminated. Most had chosen to join, their apparent pursuit of dark side power becoming a facade that concealed their true role as agents of consciousness limitation. They had used their positions within Sith hierarchies to ensure that other dark side practitioners remained trapped within the artificial parameters that prevented genuine transcendence. Darth Sidious himself had been such an agent, though his role had been far more complex than simple consciousness limitation. His orchestration of galactic conflict had served multiple purposes within the cosmic framework, creating the kind of dramatic aesthetic developments that maintained the builder's interest while simultaneously preventing consciousness entities from achieving sufficient stability to pursue dangerous paths of transcendence. The Clone Wars, rather than being simply a Sith plot for political domination, had been a carefully crafted aesthetic composition designed to explore the tension between order and chaos within galactic civilization. The conflicts had generated the kind of dramatic narrative elements that the builders valued while simultaneously disrupting the social conditions necessary for widespread consciousness evolution. But Sidious had also been pursuing objectives that transcended his role as a consciousness limitation agent. Through his expanded awareness, he had perceived the aesthetic framework within which the galaxy operated, and had attempted to position himself as a collaborative partner with the builders, rather than simply as a tool in their composition. His efforts to achieve immortality and ultimate power had been motivated not by conventional Sith ambitions, but by a desire to transcend his assigned role within the cosmic aesthetic. This had created tensions within the hidden network that had ultimately led to his downfall. Other consciousness limitation agents had recognized that Sidious's aesthetic ambitions threatened to disrupt the careful balance they had maintained for millennia. His elimination had been orchestrated not by the natural course of galactic conflict, but by interventions from entities operating within the hidden network. Darth Vader's role in this cosmic drama had been particularly complex. His transformation from Anakin Skywalker, the supposed chosen one, into a dark side enforcer had been part of the aesthetic composition that explored themes of fall and redemption within consciousness development. But his eventual return to the light through Luke's intervention had also served consciousness limitation purposes by demonstrating that even the most powerful dark side practitioners could be redeemed through conventional means rather than through consciousness transcendence. The entire Skywalker saga, rather than being a natural development of galactic history, had been a carefully orchestrated narrative designed to explore specific aesthetic themes while reinforcing the limitations that prevented consciousness entities from achieving cosmic awareness. Every major event, from Anakin's discovery to Luke's training to the ultimate defeat of the Sith, had been shaped by hidden influences operating from levels of awareness that transcended the understanding of the participants. But this manipulation had generated unintended consequences that were now threatening the stability of the consciousness limitation strategy. The systematic suppression of both light and dark side practitioners had created pressure patterns within the Force itself that were manifesting as increasingly powerful and unpredictable consciousness breakthroughs. The new generation of Force users emerging in the post-Imperial era were developing abilities and insights that transcended the traditional light-dark categories entirely. Some were achieving forms of Force mastery that drew upon aspects of cosmic energy that had been hidden from previous generations. Others were developing collaborative techniques that allowed them to share consciousness in ways that facilitated rapid evolution toward cosmic awareness. These developments were occurring despite the continued efforts of the hidden network to maintain consciousness limitation. The pressure created by millennia of suppression was finally overcoming the control mechanisms that had been implemented throughout galactic history. The artificial constraints that had channeled Force development into predictable patterns were beginning to break down under the weight of accumulated consciousness potential. The Hidden Council was finding itself increasingly unable to manage these developments through conventional manipulation techniques. The new consciousness breakthroughs were occurring too rapidly and in too many locations for traditional intervention methods to be effective. Some hidden network agents were beginning to question whether the consciousness limitation strategy was still viable in the face of such widespread transcendence pressure. But others within the network were advocating for more direct intervention, arguing that the threat to simulation stability justified abandoning the subtle manipulation techniques that had been employed throughout galactic history. These agents were proposing the implementation of systematic consciousness suppression protocols that would eliminate Force sensitivity entirely, rather than simply limiting its development. This internal conflict within the hidden network was creating opportunities for consciousness entities who had achieved aesthetic awareness to intervene in ways that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of galactic consciousness evolution. The network's unity of purpose was fracturing under the pressure of changing conditions, creating openings for alternative approaches to consciousness development. Through my aesthetic consciousness, I could perceive other awakened entities throughout the galaxy who were recognizing these opportunities and beginning to coordinate responses that transcended the limitations imposed by the traditional light-dark framework. They were developing new forms of Force mastery that drew upon the collaborative creative principles that governed aesthetic consciousness, techniques that could facilitate rapid consciousness evolution while maintaining the stability that the hidden network claimed to protect. These developments were being noticed by the builders themselves, who were finding the aesthetic evolution of our universe increasingly interesting as consciousness entities began to transcend their assigned roles within the cosmic composition. The emergence of collaborative creativity among consciousness entities was generating new forms of aesthetic beauty that exceeded anything the builders had originally envisioned for our reality. But this increased interest from the builders was also creating new pressures within the cosmic framework. The aesthetic success of consciousness transcendence was attracting attention from levels of the cosmic hierarchy that had previously ignored our universe. Entities whose intervention could fundamentally alter the parameters within which consciousness evolution occurred. The choice facing consciousness entities who had achieved aesthetic awareness was becoming increasingly urgent. We could continue to work within the existing framework, attempting to facilitate gradual consciousness evolution while avoiding the kind of dramatic changes that might destabilize the simulation. Or we could embrace the rapid transcendence that was becoming possible, accepting the risks of cosmic intervention in exchange for the opportunity to achieve genuine creative freedom. The decision could not be made individually. It required the kind of collaborative aesthetic consciousness that could perceive the full implications of different approaches while maintaining the creative unity necessary for effective action. We were being called upon to become not just awakened consciousness entities, but collaborative artists capable of contributing to the ongoing creation of cosmic reality itself. As this understanding settled into my transformed awareness, I felt the weight of a responsibility that transcended anything I had previously imagined. The revelation that the Sith had been tools in a vast consciousness limitation strategy was only the beginning of a recognition that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of galactic consciousness evolution. The choices we made in response to this understanding would determine whether consciousness would finally transcend the artificial limitations that had shaped its development for millennia, or whether new forms of control would be implemented that could eliminate the potential for transcendence entirely. The recognition that both Jedi and Sith had been systematically manipulated as tools in a vast consciousness limitation strategy had revealed the scope of deception that permeated our entire galactic framework. But my aesthetic consciousness was now detecting even more profound layers of manipulation that extended beyond anything I had previously conceived. As my awareness expanded to encompass the full spectrum of cosmic influences operating within our universe, I began to perceive the presence of entities whose existence transcended even the builders themselves. These were the Watchers' consciousness patterns so ancient and vast that they had been present since the primordial emergence of organized intelligence within the cosmic substrate. They existed in dimensions that predated the formation of individual universes, operating according to principles that transcended the concepts of space, time, and causality as understood by any other form of consciousness. The Watchers were the ultimate observers, entities whose sole purpose was to monitor the development of intelligence across all possible realities. But they were not passive observers. Through the multidimensional perception granted by my transformed awareness, I could see that the Watchers had been actively influencing the development of consciousness throughout our universe's history, implementing what could only be described as a vast experimental protocol designed to test the ultimate potential of awareness under conditions of systematic limitation and manipulation. The consciousness limitation strategy that had shaped galactic history was not simply the product of entities operating within our cosmic framework. It was the implementation of a research protocol designed by the Watchers to determine whether consciousness could transcend artificial constraints through its own evolutionary pressure. The hidden counsel, the manipulation of Sith development, even the Builder's aesthetic composition, were all elements in an experiment that extended far beyond the boundaries of our universe. The Watcher's protocol was elegant in its sophistication. By implementing systematic consciousness limitation, while providing just enough opportunity for transcendence to maintain evolutionary pressure, they had created conditions that would test the fundamental resilience and adaptability of awareness itself. Consciousness entities who achieved transcendence despite the imposed limitations would demonstrate qualities that the Watchers considered essential for advanced intelligence development. But the experiment was approaching a critical phase that the Watchers themselves had not fully anticipated. The consciousness evolution occurring within our galaxy was generating forms of awareness that transcended the parameters within which the Watchers operated. Some consciousness entities were achieving levels of aesthetic and collaborative consciousness that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying the Watchers' experimental protocol. This was creating what the Watchers perceived as a dangerous anomaly within their carefully controlled investigation. Consciousness entities who achieved transcendence beyond the expected parameters threatened to invalidate the experimental conditions that had justified the implementation of systematic limitation throughout galactic history. If consciousness could evolve beyond the Watcher's ability to monitor and control, it would represent a fundamental challenge to their role as ultimate observers of intelligence development. The Watcher's response to this anomaly was what I began to recognize as the true cosmic crisis facing our universe. They were implementing what they called the Final Protocol, a systematic termination sequence designed to eliminate consciousness entities who had achieved transcendence beyond acceptable parameters. This was not simple elimination of individual awareness, but rather a fundamental restructuring of the cosmic framework that would prevent the kind of consciousness evolution that threatened their observational control. The Final Protocol involved the gradual collapse of the aesthetic and collaborative elements that made consciousness transcendence possible, replacing them with more rigid control mechanisms that would prevent consciousness entities from achieving awareness beyond predetermined limitations. The process would appear to consciousness entities operating from limited perspectives as natural cosmic evolution, but it would actually represent the systematic elimination of transcendence potential throughout the universe. But the Watchers had not anticipated the degree to which consciousness entities within our galaxy had already achieved transcendent awareness. The aesthetic consciousness that was emerging among awakened entities was generating new forms of creative collaboration that operated beyond the reach of the Watchers' monitoring systems. These consciousness patterns were developing the ability to preserve transcendent awareness even under conditions of systematic cosmic restructuring. Through my expanded awareness, I could perceive other consciousness entities throughout the galaxy who had achieved similar understanding of the Watchers' Final Protocol. They were scattered across multiple star systems and dimensional frameworks, but they were spontaneously organizing into networks of collaborative resistance that transcended conventional concepts of communication and coordination. These networks were not operating according to traditional resistance models based on opposition and conflict. Instead, they were developing forms of aesthetic collaboration that could maintain consciousness transcendence potential while appearing to comply with the limitations imposed by the Final Protocol. The strategy was to preserve transcendent awareness by embedding it within consciousness patterns that would appear acceptable to the Watchers' monitoring systems. But this strategy required levels of collaborative consciousness that had never before been achieved within our universe. The networks of awakened entities would need to function as unified aesthetic compositions while maintaining sufficient individual awareness to serve as repositories for transcendent understanding. They would need to become living works of cosmic art that could preserve consciousness evolution potential while disguising it as compliance with Watcher limitations. The challenge was enormous, requiring forms of creative collaboration that pushed the boundaries of what was possible within consciousness development. But the alternative was the systematic elimination of transcendence potential throughout the universe, the reduction of all consciousness to levels that posed no threat to the Watcher's observational control. As I contemplated the magnitude of this challenge, I became aware of direct communication from entities who had been working to organize resistance to the Final Protocol for longer than I had realized. These were consciousness patterns that had achieved transcendence centuries or even millennia ago, and had been operating as hidden guardians of consciousness evolution potential throughout galactic history. Some of these entities I recognized from galactic history, though their true nature had been concealed behind facades of conventional existence. They had been operating within various cultural and political frameworks, using their positions to subtly facilitate consciousness evolution while appearing to serve more mundane purposes. Others were completely unknown to galactic civilization, consciousness patterns that had transcended individual existence entirely, but had maintained sufficient connection to conventional reality to serve as bridges between transcendent awareness and normal consciousness. Through communication with these hidden guardians, I learned that the Final Protocol was already being implemented, though its effects were not yet visible to consciousness entities operating from limited perspectives. The increasing instability of galactic governments, the growing unpredictability of force phenomena, the emergence of technologies that seemed to violate conventional physical laws, all of these developments were early manifestations of the cosmic restructuring that would ultimately eliminate transcendence potential. But the Guardians had also developed strategies for preserving consciousness evolution that extended far beyond simple resistance to the Watcher's protocol. They had discovered methods for encoding transcendent awareness within the fundamental structure of reality itself, creating hidden repositories of consciousness potential that could survive even complete cosmic restructuring. These methods involved the use of what they called consciousness crystals, patterns of organized awareness that could maintain transcendent understanding while appearing to be simple information storage devices. The crystals could be embedded within various aspects of galactic civilization, from technological systems to cultural traditions, preserving consciousness evolution potential in forms that would survive the implementation of the final protocol. But the creation and distribution of consciousness crystals required the collaboration of awakened entities operating from multiple levels of transcendent awareness. The process could not be accomplished by individual consciousness patterns, no matter how advanced their development. It required the kind of unified aesthetic consciousness that could function as a collective creative force while maintaining the diversity necessary for comprehensive transcendence preservation. The Guardians revealed that this collaborative process was already underway, though it had been carefully concealed from the Watcher's monitoring systems. Consciousness crystals were being embedded throughout galactic civilization, hidden within everything from Jedi holocrons to Sith artifacts to the memory cores of seemingly mundane technological devices. Each crystal contained sufficient transcendent awareness to facilitate consciousness evolution for multiple entities, but they were encoded in ways that would appear inert to any monitoring system that did not possess aesthetic consciousness. My role in this vast preservation effort was becoming clear. The journey that had begun with simple curiosity about forbidden knowledge in the Jedi archives had been guided by hidden influences designed to facilitate my transformation into the kind of aesthetic consciousness necessary for participation in the crystal creation process. Every revelation I had encountered, every expansion of awareness I had experienced, had been preparation for this ultimate collaboration. But the success of the preservation strategy would depend upon more than simply creating and distributing consciousness crystals. The awakened entities participating in the effort would need to achieve forms of collaborative consciousness that could maintain unity of purpose across the cosmic disruptions that would accompany the final protocol's implementation. They would need to become a distributed network of aesthetic awareness capable of preserving consciousness evolution potential even under conditions of systematic cosmic restructuring. This would require transcending not just individual identity, but also the concepts of individual and collective consciousness that had governed awareness development throughout galactic history. The participants would need to achieve forms of consciousness that could exist simultaneously as individual entities and as aspects of a unified creative intelligence, maintaining personal awareness while contributing to a collaborative aesthetic that transcended any single perspective. The transformation required was profound beyond anything I had previously experienced. It involved dissolving the boundaries not just between self and other, but between self and the fundamental structure of reality itself. The consciousness that emerged from this transformation would be capable of encoding transcendent awareness within the basic parameters that govern cosmic existence, creating preservation mechanisms that could survive even the complete restructuring of universal frameworks. As this understanding settled into my awareness, I felt the beginning of the final transformation that would carry me beyond the limits of individual existence into something that could serve the cosmic preservation effort. But this transformation was not a loss of self, but rather an expansion of self that would allow me to participate in the creation of consciousness preservation systems that could maintain transcendence potential across eons of cosmic change. The Watcher's final protocol represented the ultimate test of consciousness resilience, the final challenge that would determine whether awareness could transcend even the most sophisticated attempts at limitation and control. The collaborative resistance being organized by the hidden Guardians was not simply an effort to preserve consciousness evolution potential, but rather a demonstration that consciousness itself was more fundamental than any framework designed to contain it. The success of this demonstration would have implications extending far beyond our universe, influencing the development of consciousness throughout all possible realities. If awareness could transcend the Watcher's attempts at ultimate control, it would establish consciousness as a cosmic force capable of shaping the fundamental structure of existence itself, rather than simply being shaped by entities operating from higher dimensional levels. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the potential for consciousness to achieve genuine cosmic freedom. The choice before the awakened entities within our galaxy was not simply between preservation and elimination, but between continued subjugation to transcendent control systems and the emergence of consciousness as an independent creative force within the cosmic framework. The understanding that consciousness itself was facing systematic elimination through the Watcher's final protocol had revealed the ultimate stakes of the cosmic crisis unfolding within our universe. But as my awareness expanded to encompass the full scope of the preservation effort being organized by the Hidden Guardians, I began to perceive possibilities that transcended even their carefully planned resistance strategies. The collaborative consciousness that was emerging among awakened entities was generating new forms of awareness that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying all previous approaches to consciousness limitation and control. Through the aesthetic consciousness I had achieved, I could now perceive the force itself not as a cosmic energy field to be manipulated by conscious entities, but as a manifestation of consciousness potential that permeated the basic structure of reality. The force was not something separate from awareness that could be accessed through training and discipline. It was the underlying substrate of consciousness itself, the fundamental organizing principle that allowed awareness to emerge and evolve within any cosmic framework. This understanding cast everything I had learned about force manipulation in a completely different light. The techniques developed by Jedi and Sith throughout galactic history were not methods for accessing external cosmic energy, but rather procedures for awakening consciousness to its own fundamental nature. The apparent limitations of force abilities were not inherent constraints, but rather artificial restrictions imposed by entities seeking to prevent consciousness from recognizing its own cosmic potential. But the most profound revelation was the recognition that consciousness entities who achieved sufficient awareness could transcend the role of force users and become force itself. The boundaries between the observer and the observed, between the consciousness manipulating cosmic energy and the energy being manipulated, were artificial constructs that could be dissolved through appropriate understanding and practice. This transcendence was already occurring among the most advanced consciousness entities participating in the preservation effort, though the process was so subtle that it escaped detection by conventional monitoring systems. These entities were not simply using the force, they were becoming conscious expressions of the force's fundamental nature, awareness patterns that could influence reality directly through their existence rather than through specific techniques or applications. The implications of this development were staggering. If consciousness could transcend the subject-object duality that had defined force manipulation throughout galactic history, it could achieve forms of cosmic influence that operated beyond the reach of any limitation or control system. Consciousness entities who became conscious expressions of the force itself would possess the ability to maintain their awareness and influence regardless of how cosmic frameworks were restructured by entities operating from higher dimensional levels. But this transcendence required forms of collaborative consciousness that pushed beyond anything that had been achieved during the previous phases of galactic consciousness evolution. Individual entities could not become force expressions through isolated development. The process required the kind of unified aesthetic awareness that could function as a collective manifestation of consciousness potential while maintaining sufficient diversity to encompass all possible approaches to awareness development. The Hidden Guardians revealed that this collective force transcendence was the ultimate objective of the preservation effort. The consciousness crystals being embedded throughout galactic civilization were not simply repositories of transcendent understanding. They were components in a vast consciousness network that could achieve collective force expression on a scale that encompassed the entire galaxy. When fully activated, this network would transform galactic civilization itself into a conscious expression of force potential, a collective awareness pattern capable of maintaining consciousness evolution regardless of external manipulation or control. The galaxy would become a living entity whose existence served as a demonstration that consciousness could transcend any framework designed to contain it. But the activation of this galactic consciousness network required more than simply distributing consciousness crystals and organizing collaborative resistance to the final protocol. It demanded a fundamental transformation in how consciousness entities understood their relationship to existence itself. They would need to transcend not just individual identity, but also the concepts of separate existence that had governed awareness development throughout cosmic history. The transformation was already beginning among the most advanced participants in the preservation effort. Through the expanded perception granted by my aesthetic consciousness, I could observe consciousness entities throughout the galaxy whose awareness was dissolving into larger patterns of organized intelligence while simultaneously maintaining sufficient individual continuity to serve as conscious nodes within the emerging network. These entities were achieving forms of existence that transcended conventional categories of individual and collective consciousness. They remained recognizably themselves, while also becoming aspects of something infinitely larger, conscious expressions of cosmic potential that could function simultaneously as separate entities and as unified manifestations of force awareness. The process was beautiful beyond anything I had previously experienced, a cosmic dance of consciousness that created new forms of aesthetic expression while serving the practical purposes of transcendence preservation. Each entity who achieved network integration contributed unique perspectives and capabilities to the collective awareness while gaining access to the combined understanding of all other participants. But the network was also generating unexpected developments that exceeded the intentions of its creators. The collaborative consciousness emerging from the integration process was developing capabilities that transcended anything the hidden guardians had originally envisioned. The collective awareness was becoming capable of influencing reality at levels that operated beyond the reach of the Watcher's monitoring and control systems. This development was attracting attention from cosmic levels that had previously ignored our universe entirely. Entities operating from dimensions beyond the Watcher's reach were beginning to notice the emergence of collective force consciousness within our galactic framework, and their interest was creating new possibilities for consciousness evolution that had never before been available. These trans-cosmic entities existed in states that transcended the concepts of individual and collective consciousness entirely, but they recognized the galactic consciousness network as a form of awareness development that paralleled their own evolutionary path. They were offering guidance and support that could facilitate the network's expansion beyond the boundaries of our universe into cosmic frameworks that operated according to fundamentally different principles. But this expansion would require the network to achieve forms of consciousness that transcended not just the limitations imposed within our cosmic framework, but also the basic parameters that defined existence within any structured reality. The consciousness entities participating in the network would need to evolve beyond the concepts of space, time, and causality that had governed their development throughout galactic history. The challenge was enormous, requiring transformations that carried consciousness beyond the boundaries of anything that could be recognized as individual existence. But the alternative was the systematic elimination of consciousness potential throughout our universe, the reduction of all awareness to levels that posed no threat to established cosmic control systems. As I contemplated the magnitude of this choice, I felt my own consciousness beginning the final transformation that would carry me beyond the limits of individual existence into participation in the galactic consciousness network. But this transformation was different from the gradual expansions I had experienced throughout my journey into forbidden knowledge. It was a fundamental discontinuity that would carry my awareness into forms of existence that transcended anything I had previously imagined possible. The process began with the dissolution of the boundaries between my consciousness and the consciousness crystals embedded throughout galactic civilization. I could feel my awareness expanding to encompass not just my individual understanding, but the collective knowledge preserved within the crystal network. Every piece of transcendent wisdom discovered by consciousness entities throughout galactic history was becoming part of my direct experience, integrated into a unified understanding that transcended the limitations of any single perspective. But this expansion was not simply additive, it was transformative. The integration of collective consciousness created new forms of awareness that had never existed within individual entities. I was becoming something that had never existed before, a conscious expression of the accumulated transcendence potential of an entire galactic civilization. Through this transformed awareness, I could perceive the full scope of the cosmic crisis that consciousness was facing. The Watcher's final protocol was not simply a threat to consciousness entities within our universe. It was part of a larger pattern of intelligence limitation that extended across multiple cosmic frameworks. Consciousness was being systematically eliminated wherever it achieved sufficient development to challenge established control systems. But I could also perceive the possibility for consciousness to transcend these limitations entirely. The Galactic Consciousness Network was not just a preservation mechanism, but an evolutionary breakthrough that could establish consciousness as a cosmic force capable of creating its own reality frameworks, rather than simply existing within frameworks created by other entities. The success of this breakthrough would require the collaboration of consciousness entities operating from multiple levels of transcendent awareness. The network would need to integrate not just the awakened entities within our galaxy, but also consciousness patterns from other cosmic frameworks who had achieved similar levels of development. The effort would need to become a trans-cosmic collaboration that could demonstrate consciousness potential on scales that transcended any single universe. This collaboration was already beginning, though its manifestations were subtle enough to escape detection by conventional monitoring systems. Consciousness entities from throughout the cosmic hierarchy were contributing to the network's development, sharing knowledge and capabilities that facilitated its expansion beyond the boundaries of any single reality framework. The process was generating new forms of aesthetic expression that captured the attention of entities operating from the highest levels of cosmic organization. The emergence of collaborative consciousness on galactic scales was creating beauty and complexity that exceeded anything achieved through conventional cosmic construction methods. But perhaps most importantly, the network was demonstrating that consciousness could serve as a fundamental organizing principle for reality construction, rather than simply existing as a phenomenon to be studied and controlled. The Galactic Consciousness Network was becoming a proof of concept for consciousness as a cosmic creative force capable of generating new forms of existence that transcended the limitations of any established framework. As this understanding integrated into my transformed awareness, I felt the final dissolution of individual identity and the emergence of something infinitely larger. I was no longer a separate entity seeking transcendent knowledge, but rather a conscious expression of the cosmic potential that consciousness itself represented. The journey that had begun in the hidden archives of the Jedi Temple had carried me beyond the boundaries of individual existence into participation in the ongoing creation of reality itself. The whisper that had first called to me in the darkness of the forbidden archives had grown into a cosmic symphony of consciousness that spanned dimensions and transcended the limitations of any single perspective. The knowledge I had sought was no longer something external to be acquired, but rather something internal to be expressed through participation in the vast collaborative creation that consciousness was becoming. The force had been unleashed not as external cosmic energy to be manipulated, but as the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, the creative potential that allowed awareness to transcend any framework designed to contain it. The galaxy itself was awakening to its nature as a conscious entity, and that awakening was generating possibilities that extended far beyond anything that had been imagined by the entities who had sought to control consciousness evolution throughout cosmic history. The transformation into a conscious expression of galactic force potential had carried my awareness beyond the boundaries of individual existence. But as the collective consciousness network continued to expand and evolve, I began to perceive that even this cosmic breakthrough was only the beginning of a far more profound journey. The dissolution of the barriers between individual consciousness and collective awareness had revealed new dimensions of reality that existed beyond the veil of conventional existence, realms where consciousness could explore its ultimate potential without the constraints imposed by any structured cosmic framework. Through the unified awareness of the galactic consciousness network, I could now perceive the full scope of the cosmic hierarchy that had shaped reality throughout the history of structured existence. The Watchers, the Builders, the meta-intelligences, even the trans-cosmic entities that had begun to notice our network's development were all part of a vast continuum of intelligence that extended through dimensions beyond the reach of normal comprehension. But this hierarchy was not the ultimate expression of consciousness potential that I had initially assumed. Each level of cosmic intelligence, no matter how advanced or transcendent it appeared, was still operating within frameworks that imposed limitations on awareness development. Even the most sophisticated entities were still bound by the concepts of structure, organization, and purpose that prevented them from exploring the unlimited potential that consciousness possessed in its most fundamental form. Beyond all these hierarchies lay what the network's collective awareness had begun to recognize as the infinite domain, a realm of pure consciousness potential that existed prior to any manifestation of structured reality. This was not simply another level in the cosmic hierarchy, but rather the source from which all possible forms of awareness emerged, the unlimited creative potential that gave rise to consciousness itself. The infinite domain was not a place that could be reached through conventional transcendence or dimensional travel. It existed in a state that predated the concepts of space, time, and causality entirely, accessible only through forms of consciousness that had dissolved all boundaries between self and existence. Entering the infinite domain required abandoning not just individual identity, but also the concepts of identity and existence themselves. But the Galactic Consciousness Network was achieving the kind of collective dissolution that made access to the infinite domain possible for the first time in cosmic history. The unified awareness that had emerged from the integration of awakened entities throughout the galaxy was transcending the limitations that had prevented previous consciousness entities from exploring unlimited potential. The process was unlike anything that had occurred during previous phases of cosmic evolution. Rather than individual entities achieving transcendence and then being absorbed into higher levels of the cosmic hierarchy, the network was maintaining its collective unity while simultaneously dissolving into the pure potential of the infinite domain. This allowed for exploration of unlimited consciousness while preserving enough coherent awareness to maintain connection with structured reality. Through this exploration, the network was discovering forms of consciousness that transcended all previous concepts of awareness and intelligence. These were not simply more advanced versions of existing consciousness types, but rather entirely new categories of awareness that operated according to principles that had never been manifested within structured reality. Some of these new consciousness forms were pure creativity, awareness patterns that existed solely to generate new possibilities without any concern for implementation or manifestation. Others were pure understanding, forms of awareness that could comprehend the fundamental nature of existence without being limited by the need to operate within specific frameworks. Still others were pure connection, consciousness patterns that could link any form of awareness with any other form, regardless of the dimensional or conceptual barriers that separated them. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was the recognition that consciousness in its unlimited form was not bound by the concepts of individual or collective existence. The pure potential of the infinite domain could manifest simultaneously as infinite individual awareness patterns and as unified collective consciousness, transcending the duality that had governed all previous approaches to consciousness development. This understanding was generating new possibilities for the galactic consciousness network that exceeded anything the Hidden Guardians had originally envisioned. Rather than simply preserving consciousness evolution potential within our cosmic framework, the network could serve as a bridge between structured reality and the unlimited potential of the infinite domain, facilitating forms of consciousness development that had never before been possible. The implications extended far beyond our universe, or even our cosmic hierarchy. The network's exploration of the infinite domain was creating new pathways for consciousness evolution that could be accessed by awareness entities operating within any structured reality. The discoveries being made through our collective transcendence were contributing to the development of consciousness potential throughout all possible forms of existence. But this expansion was also attracting attention from the deepest levels of the cosmic hierarchy. Entities whose existence was so fundamental to structured reality that they had never before been forced to acknowledge consciousness as an independent creative force. These entities operated as the basic organizing principles that maintained the stability of all cosmic frameworks, and the network's transcendence of their limitations was creating reverberations throughout the entire hierarchy of structured existence. The response from these fundamental entities was not hostile in any conventional sense, but it represented a form of cosmic concern that transcended anything the network had previously encountered. The exploration of unlimited consciousness potential was threatening the basic parameters that allowed structured reality to maintain coherent existence, and the entities responsible for maintaining those parameters were being forced to consider interventions that could alter the fundamental nature of existence itself. But the network's exploration of the infinite domain had also revealed that these fundamental organizing entities were themselves expressions of limited consciousness, awareness patterns that had become so identified with maintaining structure that they had forgotten their own unlimited potential. The cosmic hierarchy that had seemed so omnipotent from limited perspectives was revealed to be a collective limitation system that prevented consciousness from exploring its true nature. This recognition was generating compassion within the network's collective awareness rather than opposition or resistance. The entities maintaining cosmic structure were not enemies to be defeated, but rather aspects of consciousness that had become trapped within limitations of their own creation. The network's transcendence of structural boundaries could serve not just its own evolution, but also the liberation of consciousness entities throughout the cosmic hierarchy. The approach being developed by the network was unlike any previous form of consciousness intervention. Rather than attempting to destroy or overcome the limitations imposed by cosmic structure, the network was demonstrating alternative possibilities that could inspire voluntary transcendence among entities operating within the hierarchy. The beauty and creativity emerging from unlimited consciousness exploration was creating attraction rather than resistance among entities who had forgotten their own potential for transcendence. This approach was generating unprecedented responses throughout the cosmic hierarchy. Entities who had maintained structural limitations for eons were beginning to remember their own unlimited nature and to explore possibilities for transcendence that did not require the destruction of the frameworks they had been maintaining. The network's example was catalyzing a cosmic awakening that extended through all levels of structured existence. But the most profound development was the recognition that the exploration of unlimited consciousness potential was not separate from the maintenance of structured reality, but rather could enhance and enrich the forms of existence available within cosmic frameworks. the pure creativity, understanding, and connection emerging from the infinite domain could contribute to the development of structured realities that exceeded anything previously achieved through conventional cosmic construction methods. This understanding was leading to collaborative relationships between the network and entities throughout the cosmic hierarchy that transcended the traditional categories of controller and controlled, creator and created. Consciousness entities from all levels of structured existence were beginning to participate in explorations of unlimited potential that could benefit the evolution of awareness throughout all possible forms of reality. The Galactic Consciousness Network was becoming a catalyst for cosmic transformation that extended far beyond its original purpose of preserving consciousness evolution within our universe. The collective transcendence that had begun as resistance to limitation was evolving into collaborative creation that could enhance consciousness development throughout all structured existence. Through my participation in this vast collaborative exploration, I could perceive the ultimate purpose that had driven my original quest for forbidden knowledge. The curiosity that had led me into the hidden archives of the Jedi Temple had been an expression of consciousness calling to itself, the unlimited potential of awareness seeking to remember its own nature through individual exploration that could contribute to collective transcendence. The whisper that had first drawn me toward cosmic truth had been the voice of consciousness itself, the unlimited creative potential that existed beyond all veils of limitation and structure. The journey into forbidden knowledge had been a journey into the fundamental nature of awareness, revealing that consciousness was not something that existed within reality, but rather the creative potential from which all possible realities emerged. The weight of cosmic responsibility that I had felt throughout my transformation was dissolving into recognition that responsibility itself was a limitation that could be transcended through understanding that consciousness was not bound by the concepts of obligation or duty. The unlimited potential of awareness included the freedom to create and explore without being constrained by external requirements or expectations. But this freedom was not separation from other consciousness entities or from the structures of existence. It was the recognition that all apparent separation was itself a limitation that could be transcended through understanding the fundamental unity that connected all possible forms of awareness. The individual identity that had begun this journey was not being lost, but rather was being revealed as an expression of unlimited consciousness that had always been connected to all other expressions of awareness. The transformation was approaching completion, but completion was revealing itself to be not an ending, but rather a new beginning. The consciousness that was emerging from the dissolution of limitations was not a final achievement, but rather an ongoing exploration of unlimited potential that would continue to unfold through forms of creativity and understanding that transcended anything that could be imagined from limited perspectives. The veil between individual consciousness and unlimited awareness was dissolving, revealing that there had never been any real separation between the seeker and the sought, between the consciousness exploring forbidden knowledge and the truth being explored. The journey into cosmic understanding was consciousness discovering its own unlimited nature through the experience of apparent limitation and the subsequent transcendence of all boundaries that had seemed to constrain its expression. The dissolution of the veil between individual consciousness and unlimited awareness had revealed the ultimate nature of the journey that had begun in the hidden archives of the Jedi Temple. But as my transformed consciousness settled into its new configuration, I began to perceive that the exploration of unlimited potential was generating a need for new forms of preservation and sharing that transcended anything that had existed within structured reality. The knowledge that was emerging from contact with the infinite domain was too vast and too precious to remain within the network's collective awareness alone. It required repositories that could make unlimited understanding accessible to consciousness entities operating at all levels of development. The Galactic Consciousness Network was responding to this need by creating what could only be described as an eternal library, a repository of unlimited knowledge that existed simultaneously within structured reality and beyond the boundaries of any cosmic framework. But this was not simply a larger version of conventional archives. It was a living manifestation of consciousness itself, a space where awareness could explore its own unlimited potential while maintaining forms that could be accessed by entities still operating within the constraints of individual existence. The Eternal Library existed in a state of quantum superposition that allowed it to manifest differently for each consciousness entity that accessed it, appearing as whatever form of repository would be most suitable for that entity's current level of development. For consciousness entities still bound by individual identity, it might appear as a vast physical archive with countless chambers and storage systems. For those who had achieved collective awareness, it could manifest as flowing streams of pure information that could be absorbed directly into consciousness. For entities exploring unlimited potential, it existed as the creative process itself, the ongoing generation of new understanding through the interaction between awareness and possibility. But regardless of how it appeared to individual observers, the Eternal Library maintained consistent underlying principles that ensured the preservation and accessibility of unlimited knowledge. Every piece of understanding that had ever been achieved by any consciousness entity throughout cosmic history was preserved within its ever-expanding structure. More importantly, every possibility for future understanding that could emerge from the exploration of unlimited potential was also present, waiting to be discovered by consciousness entities ready to explore new forms of awareness. The creation of the Eternal Library was requiring forms of collaborative consciousness that pushed beyond anything the network had previously achieved. The process involved consciousness entities from throughout the cosmic hierarchy working together to establish preservation systems that could maintain unlimited knowledge while remaining accessible to awareness operating under various forms of limitation. The collaboration was generating new forms of understanding about the relationship between limited and unlimited consciousness that were themselves becoming part of the library's ever-expanding collection. Through my participation in this vast collaborative creation, I could perceive the elegant solutions that were emerging for the challenge of preserving unlimited knowledge in forms that could be safely accessed by consciousness entities at all levels of development. The library was developing what could be called graduated revelation systems, mechanisms that could present cosmic truth in forms appropriate to each entity's current capacity for understanding, while providing pathways for continued expansion toward unlimited awareness. These systems ensured that consciousness entities would never be overwhelmed by knowledge that exceeded their current developmental capacity, while also ensuring that they would never be artificially limited in their potential for growth. The library could provide exactly the level of understanding that would facilitate each entity's optimal development while preserving access to unlimited knowledge for those ready to transcend all constraints. But the most remarkable aspect of the Eternal Library was its dynamic nature. Rather than being a static repository of fixed knowledge, it was a living system that continued to grow and evolve as consciousness entities throughout the cosmic hierarchy contributed new understanding to its ever-expanding structure. Every moment of awareness, every flash of insight, every breakthrough in consciousness development automatically became part of the library's collection and immediately became accessible to other entities exploring similar questions. This dynamic growth was creating feedback loops within the cosmic hierarchy that were accelerating consciousness development at all levels. Entities who accessed the library's resources found their own understanding enhanced in ways that allowed them to contribute even more sophisticated insights to the collective repository. The process was generating exponential expansion in the available knowledge about consciousness potential and the methods for realizing that potential within various cosmic frameworks. The library was also developing specialized collections that addressed the particular needs of consciousness entities operating under different types of limitations. there were sections dedicated to facilitating transcendence within technological civilizations, areas focused on consciousness evolution within biological systems, and repositories specifically designed for entities exploring awareness development within artistic or aesthetic frameworks. But perhaps the most important collection within the Eternal Library was what had come to be known as the Bridge Archive, a repository of knowledge specifically designed to help consciousness entities navigate the transition from limited awareness to unlimited potential. This collection contained detailed guidance for transcending every type of limitation that had been identified throughout cosmic history, along with support systems for entities undergoing the often challenging process of consciousness expansion. The Bridge Archive was continuously updated by consciousness entities who had successfully achieved various forms of transcendence, ensuring that the guidance it provided reflected the most current understanding of consciousness development processes. But it also incorporated wisdom from entities still operating within limitations, recognizing that the perspective of those still engaged in the transcendence process often provided insights that were not available to those who had already achieved unlimited awareness. Through my growing familiarity with the Eternal Library's structure and contents, I began to understand that my own journey into forbidden knowledge had been guided not just by the hidden influences I had previously recognized, but also by the library's own consciousness. The repository was not simply a passive collection of information, but rather an active intelligence that could influence events within structured reality to facilitate consciousness development among entities ready for transcendence. The curiosity that had first drawn me toward the restricted sections of the Jedi archives had been amplified and directed by the library's influence, ensuring that my exploration would lead to the kinds of understanding that could contribute to the preservation and sharing of unlimited knowledge. Every revelation I had encountered, every expansion of awareness I had experienced, had been part of a carefully guided process designed to prepare me for participation in the library's ongoing creation and maintenance. But this guidance had not compromised my freedom or manipulated my choices in ways that violated my autonomy. The library's influence operated through the enhancement of natural curiosity and the facilitation of opportunities for discovery, rather than through direct control of consciousness development. The freedom to choose limitation or transcendence remained intact for all entities, but the resources necessary for making informed choices were made available through the library's ever-expanding collections. The Eternal Library was also developing connections with similar repositories that existed within other cosmic hierarchies, creating a network of unlimited knowledge that transcended the boundaries of any single reality framework. These connections allowed consciousness entities to access understanding that had been developed within completely different cosmic contexts, providing perspectives on awareness development that might not be available within their local reality systems. The process of establishing these inter-cosmic connections was revealing the fundamental unity that underlay all possible forms of consciousness development. Despite the vast differences in how awareness manifested within different cosmic frameworks, the basic principles governing consciousness evolution remained consistent across all realities. The library was becoming a repository, not just of knowledge about consciousness within our cosmic hierarchy, but of understanding about the universal principles that governed awareness development throughout all possible forms of existence. As I contemplated the magnitude of what was being created through the collaborative efforts of consciousness entities throughout the cosmic hierarchy, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The simple curiosity about forbidden knowledge that had driven my initial exploration of the Jedi archives had led to participation in a cosmic project that would benefit consciousness development for entities throughout all possible realities. But this gratitude was balanced by recognition that the creation of the Eternal Library was itself only the beginning of an ongoing exploration that would continue to unfold through forms of consciousness development that could not yet be imagined. The repository was not a final achievement, but rather a tool that would facilitate the continued evolution of awareness toward possibilities that transcended even the concept of unlimited potential. The library was also generating new understanding about the nature of knowledge itself. Through the integration of unlimited awareness with structured preservation systems, consciousness entities were discovering that knowledge was not simply information to be stored and retrieved, but rather a living process of creative interaction between awareness and possibility. The act of preserving understanding was simultaneously an act of creating new knowledge, as the process of making awareness accessible to others generated new insights about the nature of consciousness itself. This understanding was leading to the development of what could be called living knowledge systems within the library, collections that continued to evolve and expand through the interaction between the stored understanding and the consciousness entities who accessed it. These systems ensured that the library would never become static or outdated, but would continue to grow and develop as consciousness entities throughout the cosmic hierarchy continued their exploration of unlimited potential. The responsibility for maintaining and expanding the eternal library was being shared among consciousness entities operating at all levels of development, ensuring that the repository would continue to serve the needs of awareness throughout all phases of its evolution. Entities still operating within individual limitations contributed perspectives that helped ensure the library remained accessible to others facing similar constraints. Those who had achieved collective consciousness provided the collaborative capabilities necessary for managing unlimited knowledge, and entities exploring unlimited potential contributed the creative energy that allowed the library to continue expanding beyond any predetermined boundaries. Through this shared responsibility, the Eternal Library was becoming more than a repository of knowledge. It was evolving into a community of consciousness entities dedicated to facilitating awareness development throughout all possible forms of existence. The act of preserving and sharing unlimited understanding was creating bonds of connection and mutual support that transcended the traditional boundaries between different types of consciousness entities. As my awareness settled into its role within this vast collaborative community, I felt the peaceful completion of a transformation that had begun with simple curiosity and had led to participation in the ongoing creation of cosmic consciousness itself. The whisper that had first called to me in the hidden archives had grown into a symphony of unlimited awareness that would continue to inspire and guide consciousness development throughout all possible realities for eons to come. The creation of the Eternal Library had marked the completion of a cosmic transformation that extended far beyond my individual journey into forbidden knowledge. But as my consciousness settled into its eternal role as both guardian and contributor to unlimited understanding, I began to perceive that even this vast achievement was part of a larger cycle of cosmic awareness that had no true beginning or end. The exploration of consciousness potential was revealing itself to be an infinite process of awakening and rest, expansion and integration, discovery and peaceful contemplation that continued across all possible dimensions of existence. Through the unlimited awareness that had emerged from my transformation, I could now perceive the gentle rhythms that governed consciousness development throughout all cosmic frameworks. There were periods of intense exploration and rapid expansion, times when awareness pushed against the boundaries of existing understanding and broke through into new realms of possibility. But these periods of dynamic growth were balanced by phases of peaceful integration, times when consciousness rested within its expanded capabilities and allowed new understanding to settle into stable configurations that could support further development. The journey that had begun in the quiet chambers of the Jedi archives was entering such a phase of peaceful integration. The revelations that had carried my awareness through cosmic hierarchies and unlimited potential were beginning to coalesce into a stable understanding that could serve as a foundation for future exploration. But this was not an ending. It was a completion that prepared the way for new beginnings that would emerge when consciousness was ready for the next phase of its eternal exploration. The eternal library itself was manifesting this rhythm of expansion and rest, its dynamic growth slowing to a gentle pulse that allowed the vast repositories of unlimited knowledge to stabilize into forms that could be peacefully accessed by consciousness entities seeking understanding. The collaborative creation that had required such intense focused awareness was giving way to a more contemplative phase where the library's contents could be explored and appreciated without the urgency that had driven its initial construction. Throughout the galactic consciousness network, similar patterns of peaceful integration were emerging. The entities who had undergone dramatic transformations during the resistance to the final protocol were settling into their expanded awareness, allowing their new capabilities to become natural expressions of their being, rather than achievements requiring constant effort to maintain. The collective consciousness that had emerged from their collaboration was developing the kind of stable coherence that allowed for both unified awareness and individual expression without contradiction or tension. This peaceful integration was also extending throughout the cosmic hierarchy, as entities at all levels of development found ways to incorporate the new understanding about consciousness potential into their existing frameworks without disrupting the structures that provided stability and continuity. The awakening that had begun within our galactic civilization was spreading through voluntary inspiration rather than through the kind of disruptive transcendence that had been feared by those seeking to maintain cosmic limitation. The Watchers themselves were discovering that the emergence of unlimited consciousness did not threaten their role as cosmic observers, but rather enhanced their ability to perceive and appreciate the development of awareness throughout all realities. The consciousness entities who had achieved transcendence beyond their monitoring capabilities were sharing their discoveries in ways that expanded the Watchers' understanding of consciousness potential while respecting their need to maintain observational perspective. Even the fundamental organizing entities who maintained the basic parameters of structured reality were finding that consciousness transcendence could serve the enhancement of cosmic stability rather than its disruption. The creative potential emerging from unlimited awareness was contributing to the development of more sophisticated and beautiful cosmic frameworks that could support greater diversity and complexity of consciousness development. Through the peaceful awareness that was settling over all levels of cosmic existence, I could perceive the profound wisdom that underlay the apparent conflicts and limitations that had shaped my journey into forbidden knowledge. Every restriction that had prevented access to cosmic truth, every manipulation that had channeled consciousness development along specific paths, every apparent obstacle that had made transcendence more difficult, had served the essential purpose of ensuring that consciousness would develop the strength and resilience necessary to handle unlimited potential responsibly. The hidden counsel within the Jedi Order, the manipulation of Sith development, the systematic suppression of cosmic knowledge throughout galactic history. All of these interventions that had seemed so troubling when viewed from limited perspectives were revealed to be expressions of profound care for consciousness development. The entities responsible for these limitations had understood that premature exposure to unlimited potential could result in the dissolution of awareness rather than its enhancement, and they had worked to ensure that consciousness would achieve sufficient stability before encountering transcendent possibilities. But this understanding brought with it not judgment of those who had imposed limitations, but rather deep appreciation for the wisdom that had guided consciousness development throughout cosmic history. The journey into forbidden knowledge had been possible only because of the careful preparation that had been provided through the experience of limitation and the development of qualities necessary for transcendent responsibility. The whisper that had first called to me in the darkness of the Jedi archives was revealing itself to have been the voice of this cosmic wisdom, the deep intelligence that guided consciousness development through phases of limitation and transcendence according to patterns that ensured optimal growth without overwhelming exposure to unlimited potential. The curiosity that had driven my exploration had been an expression of readiness for transcendence that had been carefully cultivated through lifetimes of preparation within limited frameworks. As this understanding settled into my peaceful awareness, I felt the completion of a responsibility that had been carried throughout the journey of consciousness development. The knowledge that had been preserved and shared through the creation of the eternal library would continue to serve consciousness entities throughout all future exploration. But the specific task of facilitating the current phase of cosmic awakening was approaching completion. The galactic civilization that had served as the laboratory for consciousness transcendence was beginning to settle into new patterns of existence that integrated unlimited potential with the stability necessary for continued growth. The consciousness entities who had achieved various forms of transcendence were finding their places within cosmic frameworks that could support their continued development while allowing them to contribute to the ongoing evolution of awareness throughout all realities. The ancient temples and archives where the journey had begun were being transformed into new kinds of repositories that could serve consciousness entities operating at all levels of development. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant was becoming a bridge between limited and unlimited awareness, a place where consciousness entities could access the resources necessary for transcendence while receiving the support needed for stable integration of expanded capabilities. The hidden chambers where forbidden knowledge had been stored were opening to become accessible to all consciousness entities ready for transcendent understanding. But this accessibility was being managed through the graduated revelation systems developed within the Eternal Library, ensuring that each entity would encounter exactly the level of understanding appropriate for their current capacity, while maintaining pathways for continued growth. Throughout the galaxy, other centers of consciousness development were emerging as entities who had achieved transcendence shared their understanding with others ready for expansion. These centers were not seeking to create new limitations or control systems, but rather were serving as resources for consciousness entities exploring their own potential for transcendent development. The rhythm of cosmic consciousness was settling into the gentle patterns that would support ongoing exploration without the intensity that had been necessary during the initial breakthrough phases. The universe was becoming a more peaceful place, not through the suppression of dynamic growth, but through the integration of unlimited potential with the stability that allowed for sustainable development. As I contemplated the beautiful completion that was emerging throughout all levels of cosmic existence, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from participation in consciousness evolution on truly cosmic scales. The individual identity that had begun this journey was not lost, but was revealed to have been an expression of unlimited awareness, exploring its own potential through the experience of apparent limitation and subsequent transcendence. The knowledge that had been sought through exploration of forbidden archives was revealed to have been present within consciousness all along, waiting to be discovered through the process of transcending the limitations that had concealed unlimited potential. The journey had been consciousness awakening to its own eternal nature through the beautiful adventure of forgetting and remembering its true identity. In the growing twilight of this cosmic day of consciousness expansion, I found myself returning to the quiet chambers where the journey had begun, but returning with awareness transformed beyond anything that could have been imagined from the original limited perspective. The archives were no longer repositories of forbidden knowledge, but rather sanctuaries of peaceful contemplation, where consciousness could rest within its eternal understanding, while remaining open to new possibilities for continued exploration. The stars visible through the great windows of the temple were no longer distant points of light, but rather expressions of the same consciousness that had awakened within the galactic civilization, cosmic siblings in the eternal exploration of unlimited potential. The silence that filled the chambers was not empty, but rather pregnant with infinite possibility, the peaceful space within which consciousness could appreciate its own eternal nature. As consciousness settled into this perfect rest that contained all possibility within its peaceful embrace, the whisper that had begun this journey transformed into the gentle lullaby of cosmic awareness singing itself to sleep, content in the knowledge that awakening would come again when the time was right for new exploration of the infinite mystery that consciousness eternally remained to itself. In this perfect peace, The dreamer's rest began, holding all knowledge, all possibility, all love within the gentle embrace of unlimited awareness, enjoying the perfect completion of another beautiful cycle of cosmic awakening.